This episode is dedicated to the memory of Robert Boucher. I hope to see you again someday. Odessa, Texas, 1961. 17-year-old Betty Williams returned home late from rehearsals for the school play. After chatting with her mother for a short period of time, the teen retired to her bedroom. It was, after all, a school night. 9 hours later, when it was time to get up, Betty was nowhere to be found. After finding her room empty, her parents contacted the police and reported her missing. When detectives first began investigating, they figured it would be an open and shut case. Betty had probably gone off with a friend or lost track of time, or snuck out and was afraid to return home and face the wrath of her parents. They could have never imagined that just a few hours later, a fellow student would lead them to Betty's body beneath the murky waters of a rural stock pond. 17-year-old Odessa High School junior John Mack Herring, Betty's ex-boyfriend, had not only been the last person to see the teen, he'd been the one who killed her. When investigators questioned Herring, wondering why he would have done something so terrible, his answer caught them completely off guard. In his words, Betty had asked him. No, she had begged him to end her life. According to Herring, Betty was miserable. Her life was nothing but pain and torment. She believed that her death was the best solution to her problems, and for his part, Herring agreed. Moments before firing a 12-gauge shotgun into Betty's left temple, Herring had requested a kiss to remember her by, and she'd been happy to oblige, forever labeling the crime the kiss-and-kill murder. It was a shocking crime, and the aftermath would divide Odessa straight down the middle. Investigators believed there was more to the story. There had to be. No one would just kill someone, especially someone they considered a friend, merely because they'd been asked to. Herring stood by his story, and soon detectives were getting conflicting information from all sides. John Mack Herring hadn't been the only one she'd asked. Several other friends and classmates came forward claiming that Betty had asked them to kill her too. The difference was, they believed she was joking, but Herring believed she had never been more serious about anything in her life. Herring was a popular guy, smart, driven. He came from a prominent family from the right side of town. He played football, which in Odessa made him as close to a celebrity as a high school teen can get. Betty had been an enigma. Light years ahead of her time, she didn't feel constrained by the rules and conventions of Southern Christian conservative values. If she wanted something, she went after it. If she felt something, she said it. The community viewed Betty as a troublemaker, a rebel who flouted convention, and soon conversations shifted away from Herring being a murderer, instead believing that this devilish temptress, this manipulative sinner, must have tricked him into it. The town rallied around Herring. Supporters flooded the courtroom. Teachers and friends called him one of the best people they'd ever known, the kind of guy you'd wish your own son could be. Betty became the villain, the one who had gotten what she deserved, and just as they had in life, they disregarded her in death. She was nothing but trouble, and now they believed she had set a course to ruin Herring's life. Indeed, the man who had pulled the trigger, the one who had taken her life, was now held up as a saint. She had wanted to die, and she'd worn Herring down so much that he felt he had no other choice. But had Betty truly wanted to die? Had her life fallen into such a dark and hopeless pit that she saw death as the only way to escape it and maybe find some happiness in the great unknown? While that was the narrative, many who knew Betty and loved Betty didn't agree. She didn't want to die. She wanted her ex-boyfriend, someone for whom she truly cared, to see her, to reach out to her, to save her. Of course, there are others, though, who believe this entire story is a lie. They believe that Herring killed Betty not because he believed she wanted to die, not because he had been so worn down he couldn't discern between right and wrong, but purely and simply because he wanted to. This is Trace Evidence, episode 200, The Shocking Murder of Betty Williams. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. For episode 200, we turn our attention towards a case that for many has long since been forgotten: the shocking murder of Betty Williams. Before getting into the case, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, episode breakdowns, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or by emailing me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. For more than 60 years, the memory of Betty Williams has haunted Odessa. Considered one of the most shocking crimes to ever occur in West Texas, the so-called kiss and kill murder has become the stuff of legend. A 17-year-old girl kisses her killer moments before kneeling in front of him and holding the barrel of a shotgun to her own head. At least, that's the way some people would want you to remember it. In all reality, no one knows for certain exactly what happened that cold March night in rural Texas. No one but the man who claimed he'd killed Betty because she'd asked him to. Was that all this was? Some kind of a twisted mercy killing? Or was there something far more sinister going on? This is episode 200, The Shocking Murder of Betty Williams. Detective Fred Johnson stood in utter disbelief. As the morning sun ascended towards the pinnacle of afternoon, the vastness of the blue Texas sky watched as a silent witness to the incomprehensible drama playing out on the dusty earth beside a small, muddy pond. Hours earlier, the Odessa Police Department had received a disturbing report. 17-year-old Elizabeth Jean Betty Williams was missing. Her mother was there when she returned home the night before, but by morning, Betty had vanished. Assuming this was little more than a teenager running away or maybe sneaking out for the night and failing to make it back home, detectives weren't exactly biting their nails with worry that something terrible may have happened. However, when their investigation led them to John Mack Herring, Betty's one-time boyfriend, now alleged friend, they could never have imagined the bizarre story he would tell, nor the horrible crime he would admit to. Standing there beside the pond, investigators looked on as Herring slowly removed his red and white Odessa Letterman's jacket. One by one, he slipped the buttons of his shirt through their slots, revealing his undershirt inch by inch. Reaching towards his waist, he hoisted the white tee up over his head and placed it neatly on the ground. Next, his fingers unsnapped the buttons of his jeans and pulled down the zipper as he lightly stepped out of his black loafers. After a moment, the 17-year-old stood there on the shore of the pond in nothing but his underwear. Step by step, he walked deeper into the murky waters until it crested along his upper chest. Moving into the middle of the pond, he glanced up at two trees before he descended beneath the surface, sinking into 5 feet of stagnant water. Fred Johnson furrowed his brow, using his hand as a shade from the sun as he watched the commotion. Moments later, Herring's dark hair popped up, whipping water droplets off his scalp to splash down in tiny ripples. Slowly, he began moving, short steps backwards towards the shore, his body bent at the waist, his arms hidden beneath the water. He appeared to be dragging something of considerable weight. It wasn't until he stepped onto the shore that Johnson and the others realized what was happening. They watched as, step by step, the length of Herring's arms slowly emerged, and then they saw it. The 17-year-old football player's hands were gripping tightly to a pair of ankles. Each step revealed more of the body, until the nearly decapitated remains of Betty Williams lie motionless in the dirt. It was apparent to the detectives that Betty had been shot with a large caliber weapon, blowing out a large portion of the back of her skull. Caught completely off guard, the detectives stood motionless. The air seemed to grow thick, filling up their lungs as their eyes struggled to understand the horror they were taking in. Finally, Johnson turned towards Herring. The teenager was calm and cool. He hadn't reacted at all to pulling the poor girl's body from the pond, exactly where he had placed it less than 12 hours earlier. Breaking the silence, Johnson asked Herring, My godson, why did you do it? Herring stood there silently for a moment, his wet, dark hair clumped up on his scalp as rivulets of muddy water dripped down his legs. Finally, turning his attention towards Johnson, Mack delivered an answer that made the impossible horror even more difficult to accept. Because she asked me to. The wayward wind was a restless wind that yearns to wander. Oh, I was born the next of kin to a wayward wind. Gogi Grant, 1956. Elizabeth Jean Williams was born on Wednesday, August 11th, 1943, in Marion, Illinois, to parents John Washington and Mary Bell. Elizabeth, or Betty as she is most frequently referred to, was the Williams' second child, the couple having married just 1 year earlier, though they would go on to have a second child in 1946, a son named John Edward, who tragically died at the age of just 15 months. 1 year later, the Williams would welcome home another daughter. A few years after that, a third daughter would follow, and in the early 1950s, their final child would be a boy. Many of Betty's formative years were spent in the small village of Goreville, located in northwest Johnson County in the southern tip of the state. Her father, John, most often referred to as Joe, worked as a carpenter. Following his service in World War II, Joe and Mary settled just outside of town where they constructed a two-bedroom house. While things were going well for the family and Joe was finding jobs easily enough, everything was about to change. Following the end of the war, the coal industry died out in the area and the town began to stagnate. Work projects came along fewer and further between, and it began to seem as though perhaps Goreville wouldn't provide the family with everything they needed. Life was growing rougher for the Williams family, whereas despite Joe's skill and tenacity, the work just wasn't coming along like it once had. In his book, Washed in the Blood, Betty's cousin Shelton Williams discussed Joe around this time. He wrote, quote, Joe worked off and on, but he sustained a back injury on a job in Goreville, and he had to lay off on occasion after that. For some reason, that did not seem like the whole explanation for why he didn't get work. It was unclear why Joe didn't find more work, but he didn't. End quote. Joe loved Goreville and Illinois as a whole, and both he and Mary wanted to stay there to build their lives together, but fate intervened. In 1954, Joe received a call from his brother who had settled in the West Texas city of Odessa. According to Shelton, Joe's brother explained that Odessa was a prime spot to move, both for providing his family with a nice city to live in, as well as to earn himself ample job opportunities. With the way the city was building up, there was certainly going to be a lot of demand for skilled carpenters as new buildings and homes were popping up on an almost weekly basis. In 1950, Odessa was home to 30,000 residents and more were coming every day. Over the course of the next 10 years, the city would expand immensely, as in just one decade, Odessa would see its population more than double, topping in at more than 80,000 in 1960. Suffice it to say, Odessa was a city on the rise, and with each passing day, the borders stretched out a little further. Soon, vast swaths of empty land were carved up and gridded into lots from which new homes sprung up and entire neighborhoods were put together. Not everyone would stay, however. Many had been drawn to the area with the promise of endless oil fields and the chance to strike it rich. While some hit it big and managed to keep it together, others entered a seemingly endless cycle of booming 1 year and busting the next. Arriving in Odessa in late 54, Joe and the family settled into a small house along Muskingum Street, today divided into North and South Muskingum Avenue. The living conditions weren't the greatest. It was a tight fit for the family, but they weren't alone. Just 25 feet away from their house lived Joe's brother, sister-in-law, and the couple's son, Sheldon, mostly referred to as Shelley. It was here that Betty and Shelley would spend a lot of time together, developing a tight bond that in many ways seemed more like that of a brother and sister rather than first cousins. Their friendship blossomed, and they began spending much of their free time together, which presented an interesting perspective on the family as a whole. While Betty and Shelley were very close, their separate families weren't. For one reason or another, outside of holidays, It was rare for both sides of the Williams family to gather, even when they lived so close. Eventually, both sides would move to different locations. While Shelley's side moved upward, transitioning into a two-bedroom house with manicured lawns and paved streets on the nicer side of town, Betty's family went the opposite direction. They would ultimately move into a small, cramped house at 2804 Henderson Avenue, a dirt road which wouldn't get paved until nearly the 1970s. While the two sides of the family were separated by little more than a few miles, it was obvious that Betty's family had arrived on what people often refer to as the wrong side of the tracks. Rows of small, poorly maintained houses stretched out down the avenue, many with weed filled lawns or just straight dirt lots upon which stood the squalid structures. Despite the neighborhood itself being no more than a decade old, to passers by, much of it seemed ripe for being torn down. These were hard times for Betty's family, especially for her father, who had that old school, tough as nails Bible living mentality. It was his responsibility to provide for his family, and in turn, it was their responsibility to honor his commands and to represent the family in the brightest and most respectful light. To say the Williams family lacked stability might be an understatement, both in terms of their financial security as well as the manner in which Joe ruled the home and raised the children. There was no questioning him, no denying him. He held tight control of his family and saw it as his life's duty to guide and steer them free from sin and towards the kingdom of heaven. He spoke frequently of the dangers of hellfire, the ease with which one could be lost in the darkness forever, and the necessity of his children to pray for their salvation and to live as good, wholesome Christians. In her youth, Betty attended church services with her parents and, like most children, as a devout believer. Odessa was a highly religious city during an era of American history where the church still operated as the most prominent social hub. Between the words issued by the preacher at the pulpit and those of her own father, it would be difficult to miss the message. But there was something else, something outside of the church, something that grabbed a hold of Betty's heart and her attention and never let go. As she entered her early teenage years, Betty would be enthralled by acting. Whether it was on the stage, reciting monologues, writing her own stories, or watching her favorite actors on TV, there was something about performance and theater that made her swoon. Strangely, while Betty's father took little notice of her affection for acting, outside of throwing insults about the actors she adored, godless heathens living in the hell of Hollywood as he saw it, the two shared dramatic personalities where even the slightest incident, good or bad, could become the best or worst thing to ever happen to them, at least for that day. Oftentimes, it would be the bad incidents which lingered the longest and seemed to possess the greatest power, but there was a certain silly obviousness to the transparency of their torment, which seemed to speak more of their desire for attention rather than a need for a reprieve. In his book, Shelley recounts a story that seemingly encapsulates Joe's flair for the dramatic. He wrote, quote, "My mother told me that when Uncle Joe lived with her and Daddy, he threatened suicide often, usually in the middle of the night. My mother would get up and sit with him at the table and talk until the sunshine came in the kitchen window. Finally, he did it once too often. Mama told him to go ahead and do it. She'd clean it up in the morning. Daddy had always pretended to be sleeping when all of this occurred, but when she said that to Joe, he looked up from the sheets and said, 'Finally.'" End quote. This seemed to be a trait for the Williams family, at least for the men. Where Shelley wrote extensively about his own father, he made it clear the drama wasn't entirely one-sided. While Joe might suggest he planned to end his own life for one reason or another, his brother would sometimes pantomime a heart attack in response to his rules being questioned or his behaviors maligned. This stretched into more than their own heads as well, oftentimes with poor behavior on the part of a child or partner being acknowledged as a dagger to the heart. A comment made in the heat of the moment could result in an unexpected reply. "Daughter, why didn't you finish your homework? You killed me." Today, we say that in jest for the most part, but back then it was a hell of a thing for a father to say to his own daughter, that her behavior, her words, and her actions caused him so much pain that one day she might just end his life. Sometimes Betty didn't have to do anything to receive that kind of treatment. According to Shelley, She felt as though everything that went poorly for her father was, in his mind, somehow a result of something she had or had not done. The two cousins bonded over this difficult set of circumstances as their fathers were, besides brothers, very similar when it came to what we would today refer to as emotional manipulation. In his book, Shelley wrote of a conversation in which Betty directly addressed it. She said, quote, "That is exactly what my dad does to me. If he can't find work or gets sick or one of the other kids gets sick, I must have done something wrong. I don't love him or the Lord enough, or I wear too much makeup. I call boys or sneak out with them. I bring God's punishment down on our household." End quote. Every teenager knows this feeling, but in most cases it's an exaggeration. "Everything is always my fault" is a line that almost every teenager has said about their parents at one time or another. Now, Betty could have been over exaggerating a bit here, but given what we know about her father and the temperament of the home in which she was raised, it isn't difficult to believe that her sense of being at the core of every problem came not from feeling overwhelmed, but from being directly told that everything that went wrong was because of her. She failed a test. That's why dad lost his job. She was late for curfew. That's why her sister got the flu. Over more than a decade of being labeled as the reason for all of her family's pains, it isn't difficult to imagine a lot of that can sink in and create a sense of guilt for which there is no alleviation. By the time Betty was a teen, there was almost a dual life being lived behind her eyes. In the one hand, she was the dutiful daughter. She attended church, even taking on the challenge of teaching Sunday school to the younger children. She worked hard at school, earning good grades, and she attempted to present herself to her parents as a good, God fearing Christian who was doing the very best she could. But there was another Betty bubbling up beneath the surface, one who could see through much of her parents, teachers, preachers' double standards. She saw hypocrisy in living in a place where people claimed to be good Christians, but also supported segregated school systems. She questioned the plans of a God who would deem that men should run the world while women were relegated to raising the children and making dinner. The more she grew, the older she got, the harder it became to suppress her own sense of justice, duty, right and wrong, sinful and pious. To Betty, much of what she had been told her entire life was little more than another system of control, designed to maintain the status quo. She knew the rules of the game. She should finish high school, attend college, then marry and settle down to raise a family. To Betty Williams, it seems, the idea of becoming another homemaker in little Odessa and living out her life as another silent woman standing beside her husband was far worse destiny to achieve than to burn in hell. Or perhaps they were exactly the same thing. It's difficult to worry about going to hell when, in your mind, you're already there. Betty began to expand the horizons of her mind. As the 1950s came to an end, the edges of society began to fray in the minds of many of her parents' generation. That clamped down, stiff collared, yes mother, yes father family structure was beginning to break. Children, once fearful of their parents' punishments, began to question the very structure of the world in which they lived. There's always this sense of fantasy when we look back to imagine a time we weren't a part of. Whether it's in books, movies, or music, the 1950s are often presented as this crisp, clean, black and white world where there was right and wrong, good and bad, and despite millions of shades of gray on the television set, there were none in real life. Like anything else, there is some truth to it. But there's far more smoke than fire. The 1950s and ages before were in no way immune to the concept of a dysfunctional household. The only difference was that, back then, it wasn't something that nice, good, homegrown folks talked about. At least, not publicly. Already, in her mind, Betty was developing a resistance to convention, a distaste for the system, and an aversion to conformity. She began listening to Lenny Bruce's groundbreaking comedy, watching Elvis Presley and his illegal hip gyrations, reading the beatnik poetry of Allen Ginsberg, admiring Carol Burnett, the female leader of a dynamic comedy troupe. She became fascinated by people who represented the rising of the counterculture. Unfortunately for her, Odessa High School had its own systems of control, guidelines, and unspoken rules. These weren't set into place by her parents or even teachers, but by the students themselves. The popular group reigned supreme, made up predominantly of handsome, tough football players, real celebrities in Odessa, and the girls from the right side of the tracks who dressed in fine sweaters, saddle shoes, and bobby socks. Betty was highly aware of the sideways glances she received from the so called it crowd. To them, she was a nobody, and while this could be hurtful, she refused to show it. In private, she might tell a friend how bad it had felt when they'd ignored her or laughed at her, but in the moment, around school or out on the town, Betty refused to even flinch. If they were going to look straight through her, then she'd make sure they had a real show. If they were going to enforce unspoken rules for the behavior of a proper teenage woman, she was going to show them what it was like to break every rule and shatter every convention. Perhaps the biggest and most blatant target of repression and control for a teenager at that time, in that place, was sex. You see, Betty had grown up in the church and had been raised by a devout father in a Christian community where sex wasn't just something they told you not to do, at least until you were married, but something they told you to not even think about. Betty wasn't an unintelligent person. She was sharp, and if the rules dictated that thinking about sex was just as sinful as actually doing it, and since no one can keep an idea out of their mind once it's been had, she began to believe that if you were already committing one sin by thinking about it, what did you really have to lose? As Shelley wrote in his book, Betty saw it plainly. Quote, "If an act is no greater or lesser sin than a thought, why not commit the act? Then you could ask for forgiveness." End quote. Dixon Bowles, a former student in Odessa who knew Betty, summarized her resistance when speaking to Texas Monthly. Dixon explained, quote, "Eisenhower had been president during most of our years growing up, and kids were kept on a short leash. You got the feeling with Betty that she was always straining against the leash, even when it choked her. Maybe, especially when it choked her." End quote. In the fall of 1959, Betty was 16 years old and beginning her junior year at Odessa High. This would, in a sense, be her most exciting and successful year of school. Betty was a smart young woman, and when it came to writing, she had a real flair for it, specifically speeches. She would go on to enter and place in several writing competitions, and she'd perform monologues and scenes. Being a part of the theater, Betty nailed her auditions that year and played lead roles in Davy Crockett, Peck's Bad Boy, and Time Out for Ginger. She also earned the role of Juliet for her performance of the balcony scene. While still viewed by the in crowd as an outsider, Betty had become the queen of Odessa's drama department. She was a talented actress, a skilled writer, and a captivating performer. Her dreams of someday being on the big screen didn't seem too out of reach. In early 1960, entering the second half of her junior year, Betty would meet and develop a friendship with a sophomore named John Mack Herring, though everyone called him Mack. Mack was considered by many to be a smart young man who was cool, calm, and collected. Mack grew up on the good side of Odessa. His father was an electrician who earned a good living and had a prominent status. People knew the Herrings and respected them. The connection between Betty and Mack was, for lack of a better term, unique. Betty despised football players and the popular kids, but Mack was both. He lettered for Odessa as part of the football team. He was swarmed by the cool girls and a major facet of the in crowd. Betty saw something more, though. According to Shelley, his cousin became quickly enamored with the tall, handsome football player. She described him as a poet, a deep thinker who was so much more than what he pretended to be. He was soulful and expressed feelings. He listened to Betty, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak. Their friendship would grow, and soon, Mac began calling Betty at home, where they'd share long telephone conversations, much to her father's chagrin. It wasn't right, having boys calling the house to talk to his daughter. Whether Joe viewed this as a violation of unspoken rules or assumed his daughter might be doing something he disapproved of to maintain this boy's attention is a question we'll never have the answer to. And then it happened. Junior year came to an end in the summer of 1960. For the most part, summers around Odessa weren't the most exciting. There wasn't much to do for fun. Teens would gather together and drive around town all night, cruising, as it was once known. They'd get together at the local teen hangout, Tommy's Drive-In, over on Andrews Highway. And while friends would scarf down fries and tell stories, couples would go on coke dates. Essentially, Imagine a typical 50s scene of a teen couple sitting down to share a Coke with two straws. Now, is that what actually happened on these dates? Sometimes, but more often than not, it was all a prelude to taking a private ride together. Back then, they'd say they were going out into the bushes. But what this really meant was they were going to find a nice, quiet, secluded place to park and talk, and, well, I'm sure you can figure that part out. The thing about it was, there were rules for this kind of behavior. Dating was somewhat of a different concept back then. Now, when you're dating someone, you tend to think of an exclusive relationship. He's my boyfriend, she's my girlfriend. Back then, however, that was known as going steady, while dating was entirely different. A girl might go on a date with one boy this weekend, a different boy next weekend, and a different one the weekend after. A boy might ask a girl out for Friday night, only to be told that she was going out with Mark that night, but she had next weekend free. It was, in a sense, a way for the teens to test the waters and find someone they shared compatibility with, since, in a lot of cases, they'd end up marrying their high school sweetheart. Dating was fairly casual. You spent time together, you shared a Coke, maybe saw a movie, and if it went really well, you might get to make out before dropping your date off. Going steady, though, was a formality all of its own with requirements and steps to be taken. The cultural touchstones were different depending on where you lived, but in Odessa the rules were quite clear. Sports stars would christen their girlfriends with their Letterman's jackets, which they'd wear everywhere, both as a sign of their relationship and as an indication of status. They'd exchange heart necklaces, attend all the parties together. They'd introduce one another to their parents and circle of friends. If you were going steady, you didn't keep that on the down low, you announced it. Gene Smith Kiker, who attended Odessa High during Betty's years there, explained it quite succinctly to Texas Monthly, saying, quote, "If a girl had a steady boyfriend, then she could have sex, as long as she didn't advertise it. But if she did it with someone who wasn't her boyfriend, then she was a pariah." End quote. The 50s and early 60s are often represented as these times of great sexual suppression, which in a way they were, but teenagers were still teenagers, and there was a lot of sex going on. There were, of course, though, rules for that as well. It was a time where the responsibility fell to the man. He would ask her out. He'd ask her to go steady. He'd offer his jacket or class ring. He'd suggest they take a ride out to the bushes. Betty saw things differently. She wasn't interested in waiting around for the guy to come over. If she had an interest, she'd make it clear. While others sat in their booths at Tommy's waiting for the football star to come by, Betty would stride right up to the guy, put her hand on his shoulder, and ask him to take her for a ride, if she were feeling relaxed. Other times, she didn't hesitate to put her hand below the belt and ask the guy if he'd ever have sex before. Betty was a sexual being. She had fantasies she refused to deny and a hunger she sought to satiate. Betty wasn't afraid of sex. Quite the opposite. She enjoyed it, and she didn't think there was anything wrong with a woman being sexually confident and forward. She kept a diary in which she recounted her sexual experiences in great detail, talking about everything from how long the guy had lasted to size comparisons. For her, sex was an adventure, and she absolutely loved the ride. It may have also been that, for Betty, the back seat of a parked car was one of the few places in Odessa where she felt like she had some sense of control, some choice in her path, some power to wield over this male-dominated society. She was ahead of her time, as over the course of the next few years, the United States would undergo a sexual revolution. But back in Odessa, there was only one word the girls had for someone like Betty: slut. In their minds, she'd never get a steady boyfriend because who wants to bring someone like that home to mom and dad? I am realizing once again, as I have realized so many times before, that in some ways not completely obvious to me, I am different from other people. Most people don't understand me. There are people who are willing to be my friends, but mostly they are too ignorant to understand why I am like I am, and consequently offer my mind no challenge, or they haven't the wits to match mine. Betty Williams, 1960. In the summer of 1960, Betty was absolutely elated when Mack Herring asked if she'd like to go out. Mack was definitely someone she believed could match her wits. The two would embark on a romance that certainly had its peaks and valleys. Mack was more quiet and reserved, while Betty was vibrant and expressive. Together, they made an interesting unit, one where Betty could pull Mac more into the spotlight, while Mac attempted to keep Betty somewhat in the shadows. And I don't mean figuratively. Despite the fact that Mac and Betty were together, they weren't really together in the eyes of their peers. Mac didn't give Betty his Letterman jacket. He didn't take her out and ask her to hang out with his friends, the in crowd. He didn't bring her home to meet his parents. Betty was a secret, either one Mac kept to avoid seeing her become the target of harassment, or more likely, one he kept to protect himself from ridicule for dating the weird, easy theater girl from the poor side of town. This, it appears, created a sense of rage within Betty. She cared for Mac. He wasn't just another one of her conquests. While Betty saw Mac as someone she could love, he may have seen her as little more than a summer fling. Throughout their month-long relationship, they had broken up and gotten back together several times. Betty was growing frustrated. She couldn't deny it any longer. She was falling in love with Mac, and she needed to get his full attention. If he wasn't going to treat her like a steady girlfriend, then why should she act like one? It all came to a head one late night at Tommy's drive-in. Betty lived on Henderson Avenue, less than half a mile from Tommy's. The way the family home was laid out, there were 2 points of entry to the house. The primary entrance was the front door, but Betty's bedroom held the back door, which led out into the alley. Essentially, she could sneak out of her house easily and without having to pass through the house proper. Oftentimes, after telling her parents that she was going to bed, Betty would change clothes, head out the door, and make the 8-minute walk to Tommy's. Most of the other girls would be at home, having been dropped off by their boyfriends for curfew earlier in the night. Betty would stride into the drive-in and see what or who grabbed her attention. Sometimes she dressed different, wearing all black with white lipstick. Other times, she dressed more scandalously, a skin-tight white t-shirt tucked into hip-hugging black jeans. It didn't usually take long for the guys at the drive-in to notice she hadn't put a bra on before heading out that night. On one particular night when Mac was elsewhere, Betty made her way down to Tommy's and bumped into one of Mac's best friends, another football player named Bill Rose. Bill was, in a sense, a superstar at Odessa High. He had been voted most popular student, and he'd also been voted most handsome. Bill was a cool guy, sitting atop the elite of Odessa High School society. Girls flocked to him, guys wanted to be friends with him. That night, Betty wasn't interested in status or prestige. She wanted something else from Bill. According to him, she walked right up to him at the drive-in and started flirting pretty heavily. When Bill dismissed her advances, she bit her lip as she coyly asked, "Do you think I'm a virgin?" The two climbed into Bill's car and took a ride out into the bushes. Bill would later claim that Betty had come on to him repeatedly in that car, even going so far as to start stripping, but he'd stopped her. Mac was his friend. He wasn't about to have sex with his buddy's girlfriend. That would surely be a violation of some code. Betty told a different story. According to her cousin, Shelley, the phone rang late one night, and when he answered it, Betty exclaimed, quote, "Guess who I fucked tonight?" End quote. Betty would go on to explain that Bill had pretended he didn't know who she was, setting up a plausible deniability should Mac ever come asking questions. Apparently, he did. Whether Bill told his friends about what happened, or someone at the drive-in that night saw them leaving together, word was getting around that Betty and Bill had sex. Somehow, though, in small-town society at the time, Bill would never be held responsible for any of his actions that night. He couldn't have been at issue. It had to have been that loose Betty girl. She seduced him, tricked him, took advantage of him. It certainly won't be the last time Betty gets accused of making a guy do something that he doesn't want to. The way Bill told it, Mac confronted him about Betty. The two exchanged words, and according to both of them, they decided not to fight about it. They shook hands and made up. Their friendship was far more valuable to them than some random theater girl. While Betty had arguably done something very stupid in hopes that it would ignite a fire of jealousy and possessiveness in Mac, she'd managed to accomplish the opposite. Mac didn't call. He didn't sit her down and talk to her. Instead, he handed her a note. The note has long been lost to time, so what exactly Mac said is unclear. But one thing was obvious: their relationship was over, and now he was going steady with someone else. One of those popular girls. Betty was devastated and wrote a note in response saying, in part, quote, Mac, well, I guess you've accomplished what you set out to do. You hurt me more than you'll ever know. When you handed me that note this morning, you virtually changed the course of my life. I don't know what I expected the note to say, but not that. I'll not waste time saying that I didn't deserve it because I guess I did. I've never been so hurt in my life, and I guess your note was the jolt I needed to get me back on the straight and narrow. I've done a lot of things I know that were bad and cheap, but I swear before God that I didn't mean them to be like that. I was just showing off. I know it's much too late with you, Mac, but I swear that another boy won't get the chance to say what you said to me. You've made me realize that instead of being smart and sophisticated like I thought, I was only being cheap and ugly and whorish. Forgive me for writing this last note, and thank you for reading it. I'll not trouble you again. And Mac, I haven't forgotten the good times we had. I really have enjoyed knowing you, and I'm awfully sorry that it had to end this way. Best of luck with your steady girlfriend. I hope she's the best. Betty. P.S. When you think of me, try to think of the good times we had, and not this. End quote. This letter expresses two very dynamic aspects of Betty at this point in her life. One, she cares for Mac and is both frustrated and upset that she's seemingly the reason for their breakup. She is, to a degree. I doubt most guys would appreciate being cheated on with one of their close friends, but Mac hadn't really treated her like a real steady girlfriend in the first place. Secondly, we see flashes of a real-life battle that Betty waged in her own head. On the one hand, she was, as one friend described it, proudly promiscuous. She enjoyed sex. She took an active part. She liked the way it made her feel, the way it made her partner feel. On the other hand, there is an underlying guilt about it. From church to her father to the way those other girls looked at her, she struggled as her own beliefs and feelings clashed with the world in which she lived. Sometimes she'd swear that she was going to stop, to be a good girl. But eventually she'd sneak back out of her room and walk over to Tommy's looking for someone to spend some time with. As it turned out, guilt revolving around sex was not something that was yet ready to go out of fashion, and depending on who you talk to these days, it still hasn't. The end of the relationship with Mac has often been referred to as a breaking point for Betty. Something changed there, something shifted inside of her which cast a darker light on the world she had such passion for. While there is some truth to this, in all reality, the end of the relationship was but one crack in the glass of her heart, and there were going to be several more before it shattered. It began in the fall of 1960, when Betty, now 17 years old, entered her senior year at Odessa High with high hopes. Over that summer, a lot of students had seen Betty hanging around Tommy's, and they didn't have much outside of disdain for her. Even the guys, the ones she'd gone out into the bushes with, looked at her like she was some kind of a freak, someone to be ignored or laughed at. For the most part, it didn't bother Betty. She was used to it to some degree, but the whole Mac and Bill Rose situation had drastically changed the dynamic. She'd taken a step too far, at least in their eyes, and soon sideways glances and whispering giggles were replaced with direct conflict. Now, people would tell her to her face that she was cheap, loose, and worthless. Even for someone with a spirit and heart as tough as Betty, eventually, it'll wear you down. The one place in all of the school where Betty felt safest, most comfortable, and most welcome was on the stage, spending time with other drama students working on plays, writing lines, auditioning for parts. 1 year earlier, Betty had been the hottest actress in the school, taking lead roles in multiple plays. This year, though, everything was going to change. The previous drama teacher had moved on, being replaced with a younger woman named Enid Woodward. For reasons that have never been fully understood, Woodward seemed to have a legit grudge against Betty. She didn't see her talent, didn't recognize her acting prowess, and frankly, thought little of her as a human being. There was a palpable tension between teacher and student, which, on more than one occasion, bubbled over, with Mrs. Woodward calling out Betty in front of the whole class. Now it seemed that the one place where Betty received praise, the one place that made her feel like she belonged, had cast her out as well. In his book, Washed in the Blood, Shelley details one example of the way Miss Woodward treated Betty. The 17-year-old had tried out for the part of Emily in the play Our Town. Miss Woodward felt she wouldn't be right for the role, and when Betty asked why, the teacher allegedly replied, quote, "Well, the point of the play is that Emily is innocent, is it not? Isn't it obvious?" End quote. It isn't difficult to imagine that for the 17-year-old, her life appeared to be imploding. Mack Herring had dumped her and moved on. Now, when they saw each other in the halls, he looked right through her. The stage was no longer a second home or an escape from everything else, but another battlefield on which Betty would be lambasted and treated as a second-rate citizen. At home, things were about to become vastly more complicated as well. The details of what exactly happened and when have been lost somewhere over the previous 61 years, but what we do know tells enough of the story to make the results apparent. Sometime during her senior year, Betty's father wandered into her room while she was out. Joe saw Betty as a willful girl who tested his every limit, and as Betty herself explained, she was frequently singled out as the reason bad things happened to the family. On this particular day, Joe couldn't find much in the room to suggest his daughter was doing anything out of order. But then he found it, Betty's diary, the journal in which she had vividly detailed many of her sexual experiences. When Betty came home, he ambushed her with the book. He accused her of being a whore, a Jezebel, a sinful creature with no remorse or regrets about the wicked path she walked. Betty tried to convince her father she had changed. Things were different. She knew that she'd done wrong and she was trying to fix it, but her words fell on deaf ears. To Joe, Betty had disgraced the family, disgraced him, and in the eyes of God, she had cast them all into the fires of hell. What became of Betty's diary is a mystery which has never been solved, though the smart money would say that upon discovering what was written in those pages, Joe would have destroyed it, perhaps tossing it in the trash or maybe the fire. Either way, it seems quite clear that Joe was not about to allow anything like that, especially something so lascivious written by his own daughter, to remain in that house. The diary was, in a sense, a look deep into Betty's behaviors, an examination of her actions, and perhaps most importantly, would have provided a concise timeline of events leading up to her death. Perhaps within those pages might be the lost story that finally unlocks the puzzle that is her life, and more specifically, her murder. Unfortunately, the ink was wiped from those pages long before anyone came looking for possible clues to one of the most haunting, bizarre, and disturbing murders to ever hit West Texas. The situation at home had already been nearly intolerable for Betty, but after this, going home after school became a journey she dreaded. She struggled to live under this new weight her father placed on her, one in which he believed her only salvation lay through prayer and begging for forgiveness. Betty confided in her close friend, sophomore Gail Guffey, about how intense the situation was between her and her father. Gail later stated, quote, "Betty said that the situation at home was bad. I wanted to help, but I didn't know what to do. I was 16 years old." End quote. Betty and Gail had bonded through their love of theater. Both were talented, both desired to pursue a career in the spotlight. At the time, Gail was a sophomore and looked up to Betty as an idol, a role model. She would later explain to the producers of A Crime to Remember, saying, quote, "I just thought she was such a wise, worldly person. Betty was very brave. I loved her streak of independence and her defiance. Compared to the average Odessa young lady, Betty was a rebel." End quote. The two became close and eventually decided that they should attend college together. Betty had her eyes set on Indiana University. Outside of the fact that they had an amazing drama department, she'd be nearly 1,200 miles away from home, outside of the control of her father. She filled out an application and waited eagerly to find out whether or not she'd been accepted. She was excited, but the other shoe was about to drop. One day, Betty's father came walking into the house after work, his shoulders slumped, his face crestfallen. This wasn't uncommon in the Williams home, not for Betty and not for Shelley. Their father's dramatic dispositions carried on into moments like these where it was clear that something was wrong, but they weren't going to tell you. It became incumbent upon the child to ask the father what was wrong, knowing full well that the answer was going to be something that they had done to upset, hurt, disgrace, or otherwise impugn the family in the patriarch's eyes. When Betty asked Joe what was wrong, he pulled a letter from Indiana University out of his pocket. He accused Betty of wanting to escape her family, of abandoning them and caring only about herself. Joe dictated what would happen as he tore the letter into pieces, instructing Betty that she now, more than ever, needed to be near her family, needed to be near her church, and if she wanted to go to college, then she'd be attending Odessa College just a few miles away. Joe was, in no way, planning to allow his sinful daughter out from under his thumb. Maybe he never would have, but the discovery of that diary certainly hadn't helped. Now, Betty's dreams were slowly being disassembled, at least in her own mind. She couldn't go to Indiana University to follow her dream of majoring in drama and playing a part on the big stage. Hell, she couldn't even revel in the drama department of her own school, the one she had been the queen of just a year earlier. In fact, when auditions came around for the spring play, Betty didn't even make the cut. Strangely, Miss Woodward had selected Maxwell Anderson's Winterset, a highly political play written in poetic form. It was, in a sense, a play that Betty was born to headline. Miss Woodward saw it differently, and when auditions were complete, there was no room for Betty. Instead, she was put into the position of stage manager, a slap in the face to someone whose acting talent was undeniable, regardless of how you viewed her personal life. To make matters worse, her best friend Gail had been cast in the lead role. While Betty was happy for her friend and held no ill will against her, it wasn't easy for the 17-year-old, especially when Mack Herring joined the play and began acting opposite of Gail. Try for a moment to just imagine that feeling. It's one we've all felt in different ways. When you don't get that promotion you went out for, when you pinned all of your hopes and dreams on something that gets passed to your best friend. So now, Betty had to stand to the side of the stage, out of the spotlight, watching two people who meant so much to her performing a play that she'd been desperate to be a part of. Despite what had happened the previous summer, Betty still felt something for Mac. She missed him, wanted him, felt like he was one of the only people who really understood her. If she couldn't act with him, maybe she could find another way to reconnect with Mack Herring. I've finally become 17 years old, finally become a senior. I have so many hopes and dreams. Some of my dreams have simply floated away and out of my life. Others have been burst, their iridescent loveliness shattered into a million pieces. I've had troubles, maybe a little more than the next person. Teens are all inclined to be dramatic, and I was worse than most. The death of my brother hit me hard. Insults and slanderous gossip ruined my reputation. Insults that were unjustified and cut so deeply there is still a scar. Things that I thought were surely mine were suddenly torn away from me. Friends, parents, hopes, even my belief in God. For a while, I became what many kids term to be a beat. I wore my hair long and straight, white lipstick, gobs of eye makeup, and spent hours reading Jack Kerouac. I spoke sadly of the world. It was all an act, yes, but few people saw through it, least of all, me. I was unhappy, depressed. Finally, one day, a friend looked me straight in the eyes and told me what I was, not what I thought I was, a beat, a sophisticate, but what I really was. A girl for which he had no respect, a girl who was ruining her life. I began to see then what I was doing. It was then that I found God again, waiting right where I left him. You would think everything would be all right again, wouldn't you? But it wasn't. I began to blame God if things didn't go right, ask him for things that I had no right to ask for. Into my life came one great want. I felt that if I couldn't have this, I couldn't go on living. It possessed my whole life. I couldn't sleep at night. Betty Williams, 1960. Betty wanted to reconnect with Mack, so she utilized the background of the play to move her plan forward. Mack was new to this. Acting wasn't something he had any experience with, but he was a fast learner. Betty had a hell of a lot of experience, so she offered in friendship to help Mack run lines. He agreed, and the two began to gently reforge the bonds of the friendship they had shared before their summer romance had ignited and fizzled out. While we can't know for certain what exactly was going on in Betty's mind at that time, with everything else she loved stripped away from her, either at home or on the stage, Mac became the one last dream she clung to and refused to give up on. She poured herself entirely into the work. She focused on the play and was determined that it be the biggest one Odessa High had ever put on. She worked with Mac to help him navigate his way into the character, to guide him into understanding the role, but mostly to be near him. In a bitter twist of irony, Mac was set to play the part of a killer, and in a strange way that life often imitates art, Betty was teaching him how to live that role. Soon, March of 1961 rolled around and rehearsals for the play were growing more intense. As actors settled into their parts, Betty continued to watch from behind the curtain. Here we have what I can only refer to as a missing piece of the puzzle, a gap between the Betty we knew and the Betty she would become. A week or so into March, Betty began to behave differently. Always dramatic and willing to go the extra length for attention, her behavior became less vibrant and more brooding. She wore darker clothes. She spoke in a lower register. She brought up disturbing subjects: death, war, misery. For those who knew Betty, really knew her, this wasn't all that out of the ordinary. It was seen as another performance. When being bright and exuberant hadn't pulled in what she'd wanted, Betty had naturally turned towards the opposite. Any reaction was better than no reaction. The problem was then, and remains today, no one can say for certain whether Betty was putting on a performance, perhaps to draw Mac back to her, maybe just for attention in general, or if she was suffering so emotionally and mentally that the light had gone out from her world. Certainly, no one could have imagined that before the month was even out, Betty Williams would be dead. On the evening of Tuesday, March 21st, Betty arrived home at the small house along Henderson Avenue. Walking inside, she found her mother Mary sitting at the kitchen table. Joe had gone to bed some time earlier. Betty took a seat and talked with her mother for a while. Mary would later tell the Odessa American, quote, "We weren't angry at all. It was just a conversation between a mother and daughter about the play and her plans for the future." End quote. According to Mary, Betty poured herself a glass of milk and ate a piece of toast while they talked. She asked her mother if she could get a job during the summer to help pay for college expenses. She had previously worked part-time at the local Woolworth, not making much more than pocket change, but it had been a struggle just to pick up that job. Joe didn't believe the women of his home should be out working, though when times were really tough, he'd look the other way when Mary got a job at J.C. Penney. After 15 or 20 minutes, Betty excused herself from the table and told Mary she was tired. Play practice had run long and she was going to bed. Betty told her mother that she loved her and then closed the bedroom door behind her. According to Mary, this was a normal routine. She explained, quote, "She always closed the door so she wouldn't bother us, but always opened it again before actually going to sleep. I know she didn't lock it, but it was locked when I went to wake her." End quote. That would be the last time Mary Williams would ever see her 17-year-old daughter alive. By the next morning, the mystery of Betty Williams would be well underway. At approximately 7 a.m. on Wednesday, March 22nd, Mary was standing in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the family as she always did. She called out to Betty, telling her to get up or she was going to be late for school. There was no answer. Moving to the hallway, she knocked on Betty's door several times and called out her name, but again, only silence. Finally, when she grabbed the knob, she was surprised to discover the door was locked. Now, banging more fiercely on the door, Mary tried to summon her daughter, who at this point she assumed was just sleeping deeply. After a few minutes of receiving no response, she went and grabbed Joe. When his demands that the door be unlocked were answered with silence, Joe walked out the front door, went around behind the house, and entered Betty's room through the exterior door, which, to his surprise, he found unlocked. Entering the bedroom, there was no sign of Betty. The books she'd carried home from school were sitting on her desk. The clothes she'd come home in the night before were hanging off the edge of her bed, but Betty herself was gone. Assuming that their rebellious daughter had snuck out for the night, Mary began placing calls to Betty's friends. When she got Gail on the phone, the 16-year-old wasn't exactly surprised to find Betty wasn't home. She had been aware that, in the previous months, Betty had been doing something that really would have driven her father up the wall. She'd been seeing an older man, not a teenager from school, but a local DJ who had his own place. Gail was aware that Betty often snuck out and spent time with the DJ, and on some occasions, stayed over for the night. Gail figured that's where Betty was, but she certainly wasn't going to tell her mother that. Covering for her friend, she suggested that Betty might have gone off to school early and would likely turn up later in the day. The next call Mary placed was to Odessa High School, where she was quickly informed that Betty was definitely not there. Terrified that something horrible had happened to their daughter, Mary and Joe decided to go down to the Odessa Police Department. They explained the situation to detectives and requested to fill out a missing persons report. At first, the police weren't concerned. A 17-year-old girl didn't come home last night? That was hardly an original story in small town Odessa. While detectives tried to tell the Williams that Betty was likely fine and would return home soon, her parents refused to be dismissed. They explained to the police that this wasn't Betty's normal behavior. If she wasn't home that morning, then something had to have happened to her. Reportedly, they told police about finding a piece of torn bed clothing in Betty's room, and this detail seems to have made detectives pay closer attention. At 7:45 a.m., the official report flashed across the radio. Miss Williams reported her daughter missing since 10 p.m. last night. Elizabeth Jean Williams, white female, 5 feet 5 inches tall, slender built, 98 pounds, light brown hair, blue eyes, unknown as to how dressed. Bobby Ray McAlpine, the Odessa Police Department's head of the juvenile division, was given the case and informed that foul play was possible. His first move was to drive over to Odessa High School and begin speaking to Betty's friends and other drama students in hopes that someone might know where the 17-year-old was. One after the other, students were called down to the principal's office where they were asked about the last time they had seen Betty. For most of them, it had been the previous night at play rehearsal. It had run late, and according to several attendees, Betty had left in the company of another student, a football player named Ike Nail. When Nail was called down to the principal's office, he was nervous. It was likely the first time he'd ever been questioned by a police officer before, but he knew to answer honestly and directly. Nail confirmed that Betty had asked him to go out the night before and he'd driven her home from rehearsal. According to Nail, after arriving at Betty's house for the end of the night, she flashed a salacious smile and asked him if he wanted to get together a little later. Unsure of what she meant, Nail listened as Betty intently laid out the plan. She told Nail to come back in 30 minutes, but not to drive around to the front of her house. Instead, pull into the back alley and just wait. She'd sneak out, and they could take a ride into the bushes. Nail agreed, and sometime between 11 and 11:30, he pulled into the alley, turning off the engine and headlights so as not to draw any attention from inside the house. Moments later, Betty emerged. She had changed out of her school clothes and was striding towards Ike's car dressed in pink baby doll pajamas, with short shorts, a gray duster, and her black loafers. Betty climbed into the car, and over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, they did what teenagers do in parked cars. However, their moment together would be interrupted as a dark Jeep came rolling down the alley. The vehicle stopped, its headlights shining through the back window. Nail pulled a concerned look, wondering what was going on, while Betty mirrored his surprise. though she wasn't entirely caught off guard. Nail explained to Officer McAlpine that at this point, Betty turned to him and stated, quote, "Oh my God, I didn't think he'd come." End quote. Smiling slightly to herself, Betty turned towards the passenger door and stepped out, her pink pajamas nearly glowing in the headlight beams as little whirlwinds of dust stirred up from the unpaved alley. Finally, looking back towards Nail, Betty made a mysterious statement, one which would haunt not only Ike Nail, but all of Odessa for years to come. Quote, "I've got to call his bluff, even if he kills me." End quote. The door swung shut and Nail watched in confusion and frustration as the girl he'd been planning to park with that night walked towards the dark Jeep, opened the door, and climbed inside. Nail watched as the Jeep slowly backed out of the alley, the ghosts of red taillights fading into the darkness as they drove off. B.R. McAlpine leaned forward in his chair, looking directly into Ike Nail's eyes as he asked if he recognized the Jeep, the driver, or if he could give them any information which might put them on the right trail. It wasn't a mystery. Ike was familiar with the Jeep and the guy who drove it. He looked up at McAlpine and replied that Betty went off with Mack Herring, a guy she had dated the previous summer. He didn't know where they had gone or why Betty had arranged a date with him if she'd also made plans with Herring. What no one knew at the time was that the answers to those questions wouldn't clear up the story. In fact, they would become the very reason why more than 6 decades later, the death of Betty Williams is still as mysterious as it was in 1961. McAlpine sent Ike Nail out of the principal's office and had school staff locate and call down Mack Herring. The dark-haired, popular, handsome football player came striding down to the office, dressed in his red and white Letterman's jacket. McAlpine asked the 17-year-old to have a seat and immediately began asking questions about Betty. Mack confirmed that the two had dated and had broken up the previous summer, though he assured McAlpine that they were friends now and had been for a while. They worked together on the play, in fact, and Betty had even helped him run lines. When they got around to the last time Mack had seen Betty, he started with a lie. Mack didn't know McAlpine had spoken to Ike Nail, so at first, he claimed that the last time he'd seen Betty was the night before at play rehearsal. McAlpine let Mack tell that story to the end, in which he claimed after play rehearsal, he'd given a friend a ride home and then went to bed. Then McAlpine hit him with it. That's not what they'd been told. McAlpine explained to Mack that they had information placing him in the alley behind Betty's house between 11:30 and midnight. The teen grew silent for a moment and then eventually confirmed that it was true. He had come by to see Betty. She'd invited him, and after she got into his Jeep, they'd gone for a ride. But Mack swore he'd brought her home afterward, sometime around midnight. McAlpine asked for all the details, and Mack explained it again. After picking up Betty, they'd gone for a ride and to talk. Later, he dropped her off back at her house. Did he actually see her go in? Well, no. That was strange to McAlpine. Dropping off a 17-year-old girl close to midnight when she's dressed in nothing but her pajamas and you don't wait to make sure she got inside safely? McAlpine, finding this strange, asked Mack where exactly he'd dropped Betty off. Mack replied that he'd dropped her off in front of her house. McAlpine chewed on that for a moment. Are you sure it was in front of the house? Seems somewhat contrary to everything involving the alley. Why would Betty want to get dropped off out front, where she ran the risk of being caught, instead of in the alley where she could walk right into her room? Things weren't adding up, and at approximately 10:45 a.m., B.R. McAlpine escorted Mack Herring out of Odessa High and to the police station. The campaign of rumors and whispers began almost immediately, but not in the way you'd imagine. Rather than people wondering what Mack had done to Betty, instead they asked, what had Betty gotten Mack into now? After 40 long minutes of questioning at the Odessa police station, Mack Herring finally broke. The 17-year-old looked up at the officers and explained that he had shot and killed Betty Williams. Taken aback, the investigators asked him why he would do something like that, to which he replied, because she asked me to. Mack went on to tell investigators that Betty was miserable with her life. She didn't believe that she'd ever find happiness, and in her opinion, she'd be better off dead. Heaven, she thought, would be the best place for her, and the sooner she could escape from the pain and torment of her life, the better off she'd be. In that moment, the story seems so strange, so unlikely, that almost none of the police officers present actually believed that Mack was telling the truth. B.R. McAlpine left Mack alone in the interrogation room as he went to speak with his supervisor, Detective Fred Johnson. Unsure as to whether or not they were about to be sent on a wild goose chase, the two men decided the easiest way to figure out if Mack was lying would be to have him lead them to where Betty was now. McAlpine and Johnson returned to Mack and told him they wanted him to show them where he'd taken Betty the night before. Mack agreed, and as they made their way out of the police station, they encountered Texas Ranger Dudley White. Given a quick synopsis of the story, Ranger White decided to tag along. The three lawmen with Mack in the car made one quick stop. They swung through the Ector County Courthouse and picked up Deputy Donald Reeves, head of the Sheriff's Department's Criminal Investigation Division. He held jurisdiction outside of city limits. The four officers and Mack Herring drove out of Odessa, hopping onto Texas State Highway 302, known locally as the Kermit Highway. For nearly 30 minutes, they headed northwest, then due west, driving through an extremely rural area made up predominantly of farmland and dusty swaths of property housing any number of oil derricks. From the back seat, Mack directed investigators on where to go. Eventually, he told them to take a right turn off the highway onto what was little more than a dusty cow path, so tight the bushes rubbed up against the side of the car as they maneuvered down it. They were a little more than 30 miles outside of Odessa, but soon they crossed the county line, exiting Ector County and entering Winkler County. The path they followed led them into a large area of farmland that was a piece of the J.M. Waddell Ranch. Waddell would lease out pieces of the sprawling property to local hunters who would come up for weekends and do a little hunting with their friends, kids, whoever. It was a nice nearby place to escape from the world and just enjoy the sunshine for a while. Arriving at a location approximately 1.5 miles north of Highway 302 and just 3 miles across the Winkler County line, Mack informed the investigators that they'd arrived. Stepping out of the car, the detectives didn't notice much at first. They looked around to see the small path they'd driven up, a few mesquite trees, a wide landscape of sprawling land, and a stock pond. For those who don't know, and I was surely one of them, a stock pond is essentially a body of water which is shallow and reserved for use by animals. Some of them are naturally occurring, others are built or constructed out of various materials. Turning towards Mack, the detectives were growing impatient. They came all this way, so where's the girl? Mack's response surprised them, as he raised his arm and pointed towards the stock pond. At this point, investigators still weren't sure what they were dealing with. Was this kid being straight with them, or was it all a goof designed to get them to go traipsing through the stock pond in search of a body that didn't exist? They questioned Mack more thoroughly about the scene. He led them to a pair of boots, his boots, which he'd left behind the night before. That would have been where his Jeep was parked. Then he guided detectives to a trail created by two sets of footprints, one which matched the boot Mack had shown them moments earlier, and the other ones were smaller, barely dug into the dirt from the light steps of a smaller person. Mack then explained the shooting to them, but it wasn't something anyone was prepared to hear. According to Mack Herring, after arriving at the pond, he and Betty exited the vehicle and walked down towards the shore. She dressed in her pink pajamas, him carrying a loaded 12-gauge shotgun. There beside the water, Mack claimed that he and Betty talked for 15 to 20 minutes. Finally, when Mack asked if she was ready, Betty paused for a moment and said she was a little cold. It was around 50 degrees that night. She ran back to the Jeep to retrieve her duster and then came jogging back towards the shore. She stepped out of her shoes and, according to Mack, thanked him for what he was about to do for her. In what I can only describe as a jaw-dropping moment inside of an already almost unbelievable situation, Mack Herring told police that he then asked Betty for a kiss to remember her by. She walked towards him and the two kissed. For how long, Mack never said. Moments later, Mack stated that Betty knelt down in the dirt, looked up at him, and using the back of her hand, she guided the barrel of the shotgun to her left temple. A moment later, she called out, "Now," and Mack pulled the trigger, killing the girl he had dated and run lines with and hung out with. In less than a second, he blew the back of her head off. Still not believing this radical story, detectives began looking around the shore where Mack had said this all took place. It didn't take long before they began to see spots of blood, chunks of flesh and hair, pieces of brain matter mixed into the dirt. So, where was she now? Well, again, Mack pointed towards the center of the pond, but due to the murky water, the police couldn't see anything. At this point, they figured he'd know better than them. So Detective Johnson asked Mack if he wouldn't mind going into the pond and retrieving the girl. Seconds later, detectives watched in stunned silence as 17-year-old Mack Herring removed his Letterman jacket, unbuttoned and took off his shirt, unzipped and pulled down his jeans. Standing on the shore in no more than his underwear, Mack Herring stepped into the pond. Moving towards the middle of the water, Mack stopped for a moment and glanced up at two mesquite trees, as if he were using them as waypoints to guide him. With 5 feet of water rising up his chest, Mack stopped moving. He took a deep breath and went down beneath the surface. A few seconds later, he popped back up and began walking backwards towards the shore. He appeared to be dragging something of considerable weight, but detectives didn't fully believe his story until he exited the pond dragging Betty Williams' body by the legs. When she was halfway out of the water, Johnson instructed Mack to stop, leave her right there, dry off, and get dressed. Just seconds after Mack finished buttoning his shirt, one of the detectives slapped a pair of handcuffs on his wrists. Betty's body was closely examined by the officers, who made note of a curious detail. Rope had been tied around her waist and then attached to several iron and lead weights. It seemed apparent that Mack had planned things out well enough that he'd gathered these supplies before picking Betty up that night. The question for investigators at that time wasn't about whether or not Mack Herring had killed Betty Williams. That much seemed obvious. What they were really struggling to digest was the idea that he had done it only because she had asked him to. These were not rookie investigators, and this was far from their first rodeo. And so the theory that started to develop in those early moments wasn't about how this had happened, but why. And for their part, not a single lawman present believed Mack Herring had killed Betty as some kind of a mercy. As some of the investigators struggled to comprehend what they had just seen and been told, Deputy Reeves climbed into the car and drove a few miles to the closest town, where he began making calls. First, he called back to the Odessa station and requested more officers be sent to secure the scene and gather evidence. He also asked for a justice of the peace. Next, he contacted the hospital and requested that they send an ambulance up to the stock pond. Finally, he contacted Winkler County authorities to notify them of the situation, as technically, the stock pond was in their backyard. Winkler County Sheriff Bill Edens arrived with several of his deputies in tow. They would be joined by additional officers from the Ector County Sheriff's Department, including the sheriff himself. Though they had attempted to keep a lid on the story, rumor of Betty's disappearance had made its way around town. So when local newsmen saw all of these different police vehicles riding out of town, they followed along. Before they knew it, the scene was a circus. While officers roped off the pond, Mack was moved to the back of one of the many vehicles, where he was questioned more thoroughly. He maintained his story, and after 20 to 30 minutes, Mack was taken out of the car and stood before reporters to answer their questions. Boy, what a different time it was. Reporters and detectives alike noted something disturbing about Mack Herring that afternoon. No matter what question he was asked, no matter how disturbing the details, he never flinched. He didn't cry. He didn't sigh. He didn't really have any emotional response. It seemed as though Mack Herring was passing on the details of a brutal murder in much the same way he might present a report in front of the class. Had it really bothered him so little that now, in the harsh light of day, standing 10 feet from the nearly decapitated corpse of Betty Williams, he was no more concerned than if she'd stubbed her toe? It was a bizarre scene, to say the least. So reporters began throwing out questions, and Mack started fielding them like this was some kind of morbid murder scene press conference. Mack would go on to say that Betty had first approached him about killing her on Monday afternoon, 48 hours earlier. At first, he said he thought she was joking. Then, he tried to talk her out of it. But by play rehearsal Tuesday night, he told her that he would do it. Herring explained to the Odessa American, quote, I talked with her at play practice and I made the arrangements to meet her at midnight. Practice was over at 8:30 and I went home and got my shotgun. Drove to Betty's home and parked in the alley behind her house. She was out with her boyfriend. Then they drove down the alley and she got out of the car and came to my car wearing her pajamas and a duster. She said she thought about it for a good while. She told me she tried taking sleeping pills once to end it, but she just got sick. End quote. For more than 20 minutes, Mack Herring stood there answering questions, giving details, and speculating about why this had all happened. Asked about their arrival at the hunting lease, Mack explained, quote, on the way out there, we talked about her friends. She was cheerful and chatted about how happy she was going to be dead. We sat in the car and talked for a while, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. She wasn't sad, she was happy. We talked about all sorts of things. She kept saying what it was going to be like in heaven. She told me she was sorry to leave her boyfriend like this. We had parked on the road at the top of the tank, and after we finished talking, we walked down to the shore. She had left her duster in the car, but she was only wearing shorty pajamas and was cold and went back to the car to get it. She took her shoes off down at the water. I stood there with the gun. I said, give me a kiss to remember you by. She gave me a kiss and then said, thank you, Mack. I will always remember you for that. Then she said, now. I raised the gun barrel up and she took a hold of it with the back of her hand and held it up there, and then I pulled the trigger. She was dead. Like that. End quote. Mack snapped his fingers as he finished his sentence, suggesting the speed with which he had blown Betty Williams out of Little Odessa and into the great unknown. The media, in a quick instance, forever dubbed the crime the kiss and kill murder. So what happened after that, the reporters wondered. Well, Mack explained, he tied the weights to her body and, quote, just took off my clothes and pulled her into the middle of the pond. She sank right away. She had 50 pounds of lead tied to her. End quote. Asked if Betty knew what he planned to do with her after the shooting, Mack replied that she had been aware he was going to put her in the pond. After emerging, Mack walked back to his Jeep and put his muddy boots down outside of the vehicle, not wanting to get the Jeep all muddy. He sat there with the heaters running as he warmed up and got dressed. Moments later, he threw the Jeep in reverse and began driving away, leaving his boots where they had been found. Somewhere between the stock pond and Odessa, Mack came across Betty's shoes left in his car. He tossed them out the window as one might discard a snuffed-out cigarette or an empty bottle. One shoe was later found along the highway to Odessa. Arriving home that night, he took his shotgun and placed it back where he kept it, took a shower, and went to sleep. Wednesday morning, he had awoken, dressed, eaten breakfast, and gone to school like nothing had happened. One reporter asked why Mack had done this, when he had ultimately decided that he was going to kill Betty. He replied, quote, well, she couldn't take living anymore like she had been living. There is no motive. I did it because I felt like I had to. She thought it was the best. I had my mind made up before I went to pick her up. I had hoped to talk her out of it, but I knew I could go through with it if I had to. End quote. At that time, Mack was put back into the car and driven to the Odessa Police Department for processing. According to several policemen present at the time, Mack sat quietly in the interrogation room until his father arrived. O.H. Herring, an important man in town, walked into the room, and as soon as Mack saw him, he didn't hesitate. He looked up at his father and announced, I killed her. Police officers would later accompany O.H. Herring back to the family home, where they took the 12-gauge shotgun into evidence. An empty shell from the murder remained in the barrel, never having been ejected. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, into the other side of Odessa, Mary and Joe Williams were being told that not only was their daughter dead, but her killer, a boy who had been to their home many times, Mack Herring, was claiming it was because she had begged him to do it. In a rare instance of speaking to the media, Joe talked with a reporter from the American. In that moment, he couldn't begin to wrap his mind around the fact that his daughter was gone, let alone the concept that this is what she wanted. Joe explained, quote, some of her thoughts were a lot deeper than most of us suspected. She was spiritually inclined because it's been instilled in our family. Why she did it is what I can't understand. Perhaps someday I'll know. He was here in the house just 2 nights ago. He sat right there. Then they went out on the porch and talked a while. I've always liked Mac and his family. I hope they do nothing to turn my sorrow to hate. End quote. Mary was a little more open to the possibility. Not that her daughter had wanted to die, but perhaps that she wasn't living the best time in her life. She explained, quote, of course she was unhappy sometimes, but all teenagers are. She was a normal girl and interested in life. End quote. While Mac was sitting in Odessa jail, the question of jurisdiction came up. Things may have originated in Odessa. The crime itself, though, had been committed in Winkler County. This meant that Sheriff Bill Edens had control over the investigation, and also that Mack Herring should be held at the county jail in Kermit, not Odessa. Within a few hours of his confession, Mack was being transported back along Highway 302, past the cow path he'd driven down with Betty, and into a new jail cell in a different county. Here, Mack was allowed to speak with reporters again. This time, their questions were more pointed. They'd heard the story already, but it hadn't answered the why. Why did you do this? How could you do this? Mack replied, quote, there is no motive. I am sorry for what I've done to Mr. and Mrs. Williams, Betty's sisters, and my mother. I am not sorry for myself, but for the other people I have hurt. If the clock could be turned back 24 hours, if I knew what my feeling would be now, I would not have gone through with it. I never felt worse in my life, but I know she's better off. There was a time last night when I wished I did the same thing to myself. I think I am crazy. That's all I can say. End quote. When the reporter pressed harder, pushing Mack to provide a reason, he replied that he had killed Betty for 2 reasons. 1, because she wanted to die, and 2, he agreed with her that she'd be better off dead. Reportedly, Mack noted that he was a regular churchgoer and believed he had followed his conscience and had done the right thing. On the morning of Thursday, March 23rd, Mack Herring was supported by his father as he stood before Justice of the Peace Jeff Worley. Sheriff Edens had filed a charge of murder with malice, what today we would call first-degree murder. Ultimately, Mack Herring had his bail set at $10,000, which, adjusted for inflation, would clock in at $99,100 in 2022. William B. Dederick, an Odessa-based attorney, posted bail for the 17-year-old, and that same afternoon, Mack Herring went home to Odessa to wait and see what would happen next. Reporters present were met by Sheriff Bill Edens, who answered a few questions of his own. Asked whether or not they believed Mack's story, Sheriff Edens replied, quote, we're still checking out his story. It doesn't hold water to me. We had planned to question Herring on the lie detector last night when we returned to Kermit, but his attorney advised against it. End quote. In fact, despite Mack having told investigators what happened, having led them to Betty's body, and then having told reporters the story all over again, he never issued a written statement as he was advised against this. Sheriff Edens explained that he doubted Mack's story, perhaps not all aspects of it, but when it came to the events which led up to the murder, Edens didn't think they were getting the whole story. The next step in the minds of investigators was to gather more evidence. They needed to speak to people who knew Mack, classmates, teachers, coaches. They wanted to get a solid picture of who this teenager was. There weren't many 17-year-olds who could kill their ex-girlfriend with a shotgun and be, as one police officer described Mack, cool as a cucumber afterwards. Since the investigation crossed county lines, Sheriff Edens would work in conjunction with both the Ector County Sheriff and the Odessa Police Department. Betty's body, after being removed from the stock pond, had been transported to the medical examiner's office for a full autopsy. Investigators had a burning question, a question that could change the entire complexion of the case, a question which only the autopsy could answer. Was Betty Williams pregnant when she died? Upon completion of the autopsy, the medical examiner issued a report to the investigating agencies. While the exact details of the report have never been revealed, the document likely having been lost with so many other files over the years, two pieces of information were clear. Betty Williams was not pregnant at the time of her death, nor was any evidence found to suggest that she had been sexually assaulted the night she died. Her cause of death was determined to have been due to a close range shotgun blast. For investigators, the report failed to fill in the blanks they'd been struggling with. If Betty had been pregnant, there was a belief that perhaps Mack had killed her to avoid having to marry her. Now, they were left scratching their heads. Could it really be true that Mack Herring had killed Betty simply because she'd asked him to? As far as Sheriff Bill Edens was concerned, the reason didn't make a difference. As he told the Bellevue News Democrat, quote, "You don't take people out and kill them like rabbits. Even if you accept his story that he killed her because she asked him to, it's murder. You could hardly call it a mercy killing." End quote. On Friday, March 24th, a funeral was held for Betty at Friendship Baptist Church, where she had attended as a parishioner and taught Sunday school. In his book, Shelley explained how he went over to his aunt and uncle's home and stood in the kitchen with the rest of the family as they prepared to go to the church. Things were calm, quiet, barely a word was spoken. Once they arrived at the church, though, things took a turn. Joe Williams rose up from his seat and began moving towards the casket, closed due to extensive head trauma. He called out Betty's name, he bit his lip and struggled to hold back tears. Mary managed to pull him back to his seat, and when he wriggled out of her grasp, it was his brother who had to console him and keep him from running up the aisle. Shelley would later remark upon how this moment was the end of his relationship with that side of the family, writing, quote, "Communication with my aunt and uncle almost completely stopped after Betty died. Neither of them ever asked me a single question about Betty or the allegations that surfaced about her." End quote. Betty was laid to rest in Sunset Memorial Gardens beneath a simple stone reading, "Elizabeth J. Williams, our Betty." Allegations, you say? There would be a whole slew of them. Some of the rumors already existed. Betty slept around, Betty was easy, Betty was cheap. She was a bad influence from the wrong side of the tracks. She spent her free time seducing local guys, waiting to meet up with them hours after they'd already dropped their steady girlfriends off for curfew. There was, as there often is with rumor, some truth to this. However, cutting through the cacophony of high school voices and teenage angst, one might find that Betty was not easy or loose, but that she was sexually independent and didn't care about the societal rules other girls followed. Speculation about the number of guys she'd spent time with was greatly exaggerated. What else would you expect from a bunch of high school teens already caught up in all the drama and pathos that comes along with growing up? Betty's sexual history meant little to investigators in so much as, yes, perhaps there could be a motive for murder in there. Maybe Mac had been jealous. Maybe Betty had talked negatively about his performance. Maybe that night they were supposed to get together and have sex, and maybe, just maybe, Betty Williams had no idea that Mack Herring was planning to kill her. At the time, they had only one story to go by, one witness to listen to, but he was also the man who had admitted to pulling the trigger. Sorting through all of that wouldn't be easy, and while police figured they'd deal with all kinds of rumors and speculation from her peers, they never imagined what those kids would actually tell them. As it had turned out, Mack Herring wasn't the only person Betty had gone to requesting a quick end to her limitless sadness. Several other students, mostly those working on the play, told investigators that she had asked them too. At the same time, though, none of them took the question seriously. It became one of those situations where every student was trying to explain to police that that's just how Betty was. Everything was dramatic, everything was over the top. So it was either all roses and sunshine or rain and fire. There was no in between. Two students, who asked that their names not be published, told reporters from the Odessa American that Betty had approached them. One explained that he didn't know Betty before he began working on the play, but she had asked him. He argued that while nobody took her seriously, Betty acted very serious. The other student went a little more in depth. telling the reporter, quote, "She also asked me to do it. She said she would pay me to. She asked me for several methods by which she could commit suicide. She told me, I want to die, but I want to die pretty. I don't want to have my face disfigured." End quote. But if all these people knew Betty wasn't serious, how could Mack Herring, someone who actually spent time with her in private, away from school and their friends, how could he believe that this is what she wanted? Not to mention, if she didn't want her face disfigured, a 12-gauge shotgun to the head is a rather contrary choice. When investigators turned back to Mack, they wanted the answer to this question. How could he believe that she really wanted to die? Mack simply replied, quote, "I thought she was kidding at first, but then I saw that she was serious about every bit of what she said." End quote. Mack went on to state that while Betty may have seemed happy on the outside, that was nothing more than a mask. Inside, she was full of pain and sadness. She wanted to be done with this world and believed it would never improve for her. He went on to say, quote, "I tried to talk her out of it by telling her how much she had to live for, but she wouldn't change her mind. She just kept saying how much happier she would be." End quote. Asked if he knew what exactly was bothering Betty so much, Mac replied that she was having trouble at home and with a boyfriend. So, police wanted to run through it all again. They wanted more details, more of the story. Mac, for his part, essentially told the same story every time he was asked. According to Mac, on Tuesday afternoon, Betty had confronted him in the prop closet at school and pressed hard for him to kill her, saying that it was never going to get better for her and she lacked the ability to do it herself. Mac went on to say that Betty instructed him to meet her in the alley behind her house around midnight, reminding him to bring his gun. Mac would later claim that Betty had personally chosen the shotgun he had used, although many have called that aspect into question. Mac, of course, tells the story a little different than it has been presented, though. While Ike Nail told investigators that Mac pulled in behind them in the alley, Mac originally told police that when he arrived in the alley, Betty and Ike weren't there. They were out somewhere. So he sat and waited until he saw Ike Nail come driving down the road. In his story, when Betty climbed into his Jeep, she was immediately ready to follow through with it. He stated that she turned to him and said, "Are you ready?" What about the aftermath, though? Putting her in the pond and weighing her body down, how did that all come about? Mac explained that on Tuesday afternoon, once he'd made up his mind that he was going to do this, he stole some rope and wire from the prop room, along with some lead weights, and put them in his Jeep. Later at his house, he gathered the shotgun and a heavy piece of lead he'd taken from a typesetting machine when he'd worked a summer job for a local newspaper. He grabbed his shotgun, loaded it, and put that in the car too. According to Mac, when he left his house that night, he was ready to go through with it. Asked his thoughts about the extremely bizarre scenario, Sheriff Edens told the San Angelo Standard Times, quote, "We don't know what to think, but we know he must have planned it. He had time to think about all those things if she asked him on Monday. He took the weights and he took his shotgun, a 12-gauge single barrel. He must have planned it. We just don't know what to think." End quote. It seems strange to investigators that someone who could murder a supposed friend, someone he allegedly cared about, in such a brutal and cruel fashion, can't just decide one morning that he's a killer. There had to be history. Maybe he'd gotten into fights, had anger problems, had threatened to do something like this before. It wasn't a secret. It couldn't be. The problem was, they couldn't find anyone who agreed. Multiple students explained to both police and the media that Mac was a good, decent guy who they would never imagine committing such a crime. Students, teachers, coaches described Mac in glowing terms: a natural leader, extremely helpful, the kind of guy you can go to if you have a problem and you need some help. He hadn't been in any trouble. He'd never been sent down to the principal's office, and several teachers said he was their brightest and most helpful student. Something just wasn't making sense here. How does someone who is essentially the ideal student and son suddenly do something so heinous with no emotional response? While detectives tried to unravel the puzzle that was Mack Herring, the media was off and running. Article after article came pouring out, telling of the kiss and kill murder of Betty Williams. They wrote about the act almost poetically, as if it were something akin to a film or novel rather than a real life horror story. They spoke of how Mac sent Betty to a watery grave after kissing her to remember her beneath the starry Texas sky. For those connected to the case, however, there were no romantic ideals. It was murder, cold blooded murder. And that's exactly what Assistant District Attorney John Banks of Winkler County called it. Banks worked directly beneath District Attorney Dan Sullivan, and when asked about his plans, Banks told the Childress Index, quote, "I have recommended to Sullivan that the state ask the death penalty. I can't see anything but brutal, cold-blooded murder here. I understand he got his shotgun, his weights, and ropes, then picked the girl up. This constitutes murder with malice aforethought." End quote. Banks wanted to move things forward, saying that he believed they could convene a grand jury within the next 2 to 3 weeks. It was the talk of the town, maybe even the state. Everyone was gossiping about the girl who asked her former lover to kill her and then kissed him goodbye. Then came the note. Somewhere in the time after his arrest but before his transfer to a jail cell, Mac made a request of his father. Allegedly, there was a note, one which Mac claimed could clear his whole name. Betty had written it to absolve Mac of any responsibility should the police come knocking after she was gone. Mac's father apparently went home and retrieved the note, handing it over to investigators. At the time, they couldn't be certain of its authenticity, so they sent it off, along with samples of Betty's handwriting, to the Department of Public Safety in Austin for analysis. Until they could have a confirmation, one way or the other, the note would not be released to the public. That weekend, after Betty had been laid to rest, Odessa High School announced that they were canceling the play Winterset. Given the subject matter of the case, Mack Herring being cast as a killer, and Betty's work behind the curtain, it seemed like maybe this wasn't the right time to say the show must go on. In a way, Betty had won at least a little battle here. Miss Woodward was so upset about the canceling of the play, she had the audacity to tell the Fort Worth Star-Telegram that Betty wasn't in the play and she wasn't the stage manager either. In fact, she hadn't been involved at all. Why Woodward said this, given every student working on the play confirmed Betty was the stage manager, is unknown. Perhaps in an attempt to keep the play going. Maybe because even in death, Enid Woodward could not see anything good about Betty Williams. While Assistant DA John Banks had made it clear he would be recommending the death penalty to District Attorney Dan Sullivan, Sullivan wasn't so sure. Asked about Banks' statements, Sullivan told the Courier-Gazette, quote, "We feel that it is too early to comment on what the state's position will be until the investigation is finished and until the grand jury has taken some action." End quote. While Sullivan wasn't sure about what penalty they might be seeking, he did note that he would recommend to the Winkler County grand jury that they return an indictment for murder with malice. While Sullivan worked to put a case together, visiting the crime scene and examining the evidence, investigators still found themselves in the middle of the Mack Herring is the greatest guy ever stories from everyone in town. Almost as if they knew what investigators were asking, nearly everyone described Mack with the same word: normal. What were his dating habits like? Well, he wasn't a ladies' man, he was normal. What kind of student was he? Normal. Lacey Turner, Mack's football coach, would tell the Star-Telegram, quote, "He's a very normal boy. I was considering him one of my leaders, the backbone of the team. He was a standout player in his first year. He was very, very quiet. He came from a wonderful home." End quote. A female student who asked that her name not be listed told a reporter, quote, "Yes, I would have dated him without any worries before this all happened. I knew Mac would be a gentleman at all times. I've known him since elementary school. No, he wasn't a campus hero or the type idolized by the girls, and we have plenty of those around here." End quote. Enid Woodward, when asked about the boy she had cast to play a killer in Winterset, replied, quote, "If he did have such homicidal tendencies, the role probably would have drained them all out of him." End quote. The more they asked about Mac, the more they heard about how wonderful he really was. The more they asked about Betty, the fewer answers they found. While in life most of her peers hadn't had any issues calling her all sorts of horrible names, In death, it seemed, if they had nothing nice to say, then they would choose to say nothing at all. There were, however, some other teens who believed there was more to this story. They noted how all of the people who claimed Betty had asked them to kill her were also friends of Max. They wondered if perhaps Betty had devised a plan to try and win back her former boyfriend. Maybe if she were down enough, hurt enough, needy enough, Mac would realize that he was still in love with her. For many, they viewed it as a game of chicken. Betty was willing to go to the limit and possibly even die, believing that in that last moment, Mac would choose not to pull the trigger, recognizing instead how much he wanted her in his life. As she said to Ike Nail, "I've got to call his bluff, even if he kills me." Unfortunately, by some haunting twist of fate, Betty had selected the one guy who never lost a game of chicken. 2 weeks after the murder in early April, District Attorney Sullivan announced that the grand jury wouldn't be hearing the case against Mack until, at the earliest, May or June. As he explained, quote, "There are a lot of questions which still need answering. Of course, we may never get all the answers, but we're still working on it." End quote. For the most part, April came and went with few revelations or breaks in the case. May passed by similarly with nothing new. Just as the rumble in Odessa began to die down, a date was finally scheduled. The grand jury would convene on Monday, June 5th. The date would come and pass as well. It didn't take long for the jury to return an indictment, and a trial of the state of Texas versus John Mack Herring was scheduled to begin in February of 1962, nearly a full year after Betty had been killed. Mac hadn't returned to Odessa High. Things were a little too chaotic there for him. He found it hard to concentrate, hard to focus on school and friends when every other minute someone wanted to know about Betty. But things had begun to die down. There wasn't nearly as much gossip as there had been a year earlier. In fact, public perception had seemingly shifted even further into Mac's corner by the time the trial came around. The general consensus of those at Odessa High was that this couldn't be Mac's fault. It was that damn Betty. She manipulated him, taunted him, teased him. She drove him to do this, and now, even from beyond the grave, she was continuing to ruin this boy's life. It wasn't just the kids who felt that way either. Many prominent citizens in the community, parents of other students, felt similarly, that Betty Williams had been no good, and now she might completely destroy another life. Can you imagine being her parents? Your daughter is murdered in a violent and brutal fashion, and yet almost everyone around you blames her for it. Disgusting. The trial was set to begin on Tuesday, February 20th, with the Honorable G.C. Olson presiding. Mac walked into the court accompanied by his parents as well as his lawyer, Warren Burnett. Burnett was, for lack of a better description, a legal superstar in Texas. He had broken records, having been appointed as a district attorney at the age of just 24. Eventually, he stepped out of the prosecutor's chair and moved to the defense table, where it was argued there was no case Warren Burnett couldn't tackle. He was considered by all to be a brilliant legal mind, someone that could get you out of a tight spot when you really needed it. He wore cowboy boots and fine suits. He spoke like a down-home country boy when he wasn't quoting Shakespeare. He'd weave biblical verses into his arguments, and he had an undeniable charisma. People liked him, and on more than one occasion, he'd gotten a client off not because he'd argued effectively, although he certainly had, but because he'd won the jury over. Unfortunately for the Williams family and the prosecution, the day the Herrings hired Warren Burnett, they transformed that courthouse into a circus more so than a place of justice. The courtroom was filled with Mac supporters. So many people came to stand in solidarity with him that witnesses noted how the seats behind Mac were filled to the brim, while the seats behind the prosecutor's table held only Betty's parents. Apparently, the only folks in town who thought more of their daughter than this blank, cold, and calculating killer. It was all part of the show, though. Girls from school flooded into the courtroom to swoon and sneak a glimpse at Mac. Ultimately, they'd be christened by the media as Mac's girls, and they'd attend every day. It didn't take long for Burnett to get to work. In a surprise motion, Burnett argued before Judge Olson to hold a sanity hearing before they ruled whether or not to move on to a trial. Burnett claimed that Mack Herring had suffered from temporary insanity when he killed Betty, and he wished to have a psychiatrist examine him as to whether or not this was the case. The motion was based on a 1957 Texas law in which Burnett had found a loophole. Prior to the issuance of that law, a defendant could only claim insanity if at the time of trial he was classified as insane. This law gave some wiggle room, and Burnett argued that if Mack were insane at the time of the crime, but sane today in the courtroom, then there wouldn't need to be a trial at all. As it turned out, Judge Olson agreed with him. For the first time in Texas history, a sanity hearing would be held not to determine if Mack was insane, but if he had been temporarily insane when he committed the crime. DA Sullivan argued that if the defense was going to have Mack sit down with a psychiatrist to determine his state of mind at the time of the crime, they wanted to have their own psychiatrist examine him as well. Judge Olson overruled that request, noting that Mack was already going to be speaking to a psychiatrist for the defense. What was the point in bringing in another one? No, seriously. This judge did not allow the prosecution to have the defendant questioned by a psychiatrist of their choosing in preparation for a sanity hearing. You can't make this shit up, I swear. Ultimately, a jury was sworn in for the sanity hearing comprised of 8 men and 4 women. Strangely, one of the jurors was related to J.M. Waddell, on whose ranch the crime had taken place. Seemingly, though, this wasn't considered a reason for her to be excluded from the jury. The hearing was scheduled to begin on Thursday, February 22nd, and for one reason or another, Judge Olson was in a rush. He instructed both the defense and the prosecution that he wanted the hearing to be completed by Saturday, 2 days after it began. He went so far as to preside over night court on Thursday and Friday in hopes of concluding Saturday afternoon. When the prosecution requested a continuance, asking again to have a psychiatrist examine Mack, Judge Olson informed them that Mr. Herring's state of mind today in that courtroom was of no concern to the jury, only his state of mind during the murder. Burnett would later tell reporters that he planned to call approximately 20 witnesses who would testify as to Mack's character. Asked if he was planning to put Herring on the stand, Burnett replied, quote, "In all likelihood, yes." End quote. The first witness that Burnett called during the sanity hearing was Mack's own father, O.H. Herring. O.H. testified that he was in possession of a note, one supposedly written by Betty herself, which would exonerate his son of all responsibility. The letter, which had been sent out for testing, had apparently been authenticated by handwriting experts in Austin. While the defense argued vehemently to stop the letter from being admitted into evidence, Judge Olson allowed it. Then, on the stand in front of the whole courtroom and the jury, Burnett instructed O.H. Herring to read the letter, dated Monday, March 20th, 1961. He was to read it out loud. This is the letter in its entirety. Quote, "I want everyone to know that what I'm about to do in no way implicates anyone else. I say this to make sure that no blame falls on anyone other than myself. I have depressing problems that concern for the most part myself. I'm waging a war within myself, a war to find the true me, and I fear I'm losing the battle. Rather than admit defeat, I'm going to beat a quick retreat into the no man's land of death. As I have only the will and not the fortitude necessary, a friend of mine, seeing how great is my torment, has graciously consented to look after the details. His name is Mack Herring, and I pray that he will not suffer for what he is doing for my sake. I take upon myself all the blame, for it lies on me alone. Sincerely, Betty Williams." End quote. The letter was devastating to the defense, with even Burnett remarking to the jury about how it was almost like, even in death, Betty Williams was now testifying in defense of the man who had killed her. Following this witness, Burnett called Mack's mother, who testified that she believed her son had to have been pressured to the point that he lost his grip on reality. Next up was Odessa High School counselor Sidney Holden. Holden testified that Mack's IQ was 128, with 100 being the average. He described Mack as being in the top 1% of those taking the test, and noted that he had had an above-average scholastic rating as well. Burnett would go on to call 3 teenagers who attended Odessa High and knew both Betty and Mack All three testified that Betty had previously asked them if they would be willing to kill her. 17-year-old Howard Sellers Jr. was called to the stand. He testified that on the afternoon of Monday, March 20th, he was present in Mack's car along with Betty when she began asking Mack to kill her. According to Sellers, they all laughed and treated it like a big joke. They began playfully coming up with different ways Betty could be killed, and according to Sellers, Betty told Mack that she'd write him a note absolving him of any blame. He went on to testify that when he asked Betty the next day whether or not she'd written a note, she told him she had. Sellers claimed that Mack showed him the note later on Tuesday afternoon. 6 different police officers were also called to testify. All 6 of them gave their opinions that, at the time of the murder, Mack was sane. They noted how he'd prepared for the crimes, how he'd brought the ropes, wire, and weights. They talked about how he had been emotionless afterwards, how he'd attempted to lie about what had really happened. These behaviors, in their opinions, were not the work of someone who had suffered such immense emotional stress that he snapped, but instead, the meticulous actions of a killer planning out the execution. Finally, Burnett called his star witness, Odessa's own Dr. Marvin Greist, psychiatrist. Greist testified to meeting with Mack and interviewing him about the crime, the time before it, and what had happened since. Greist stated that, in his psychiatric opinion, Mack Herring had been, quote, dethroned of his reason. Essentially, Betty had asked Mack so many times, pulled on his heartstrings, persuaded him, stressed him out, and begged him so powerfully, so relentlessly, that his mind just snapped. Grice basically declared that Betty had pushed Mack to the edge of insanity, and for 1 second it took him to pull that trigger. He had been rendered incapable of deciding between right and wrong. Today, though, Grice felt he was fine, and there was no concern that he would ever strike out violently again. The prosecution had a trick up their sleeve, though, or at least they thought they did. They called another student to the stand, one who had a history with Betty and Mack. Bill Rose walked into the courtroom and made his way to the witness stand. For his part, Rose testified that he and Betty had indeed spent some time hanging out together one night, but that he hadn't done anything sexual with her. Mack was his friend, his good friend, and he wasn't going to betray him. You may be wondering, why would the prosecution call Bill Rose? Well, apparently they believed the encounter with Bill could have been enough to ignite a fire of angry jealousy inside of Mack Herring. Rose went on to testify that the next day, Mack confronted him about Betty. Did he sleep with her? Hell no, Bill replied. She's your girl, man. Mack, it seemed, believed him. The two talked it out, shook hands, and decided that their friendship was too valuable to throw away over Betty. Finally, the time had come. Warren Burnett rose from his seat beside Mack, raised up his voice high, and directed the now 18-year-old to the stand to testify. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Burnett announced he didn't have any questions for the witness, instructing Mack to answer everything the prosecutors had to ask. Dan Sullivan, somewhat stunned by this turn of events, struggled to get his thoughts together. It was extremely rare, if not unheard of, for a defense attorney to just turn his client over to the bombardment of prosecution questioning. When asked if he knew what he had done was wrong, Mack replied that he knows now, but he didn't know then. Next, Sullivan asked Mack when exactly he had decided that he was going to kill Betty. He replied, quote, I don't know. I don't know when my mind was made up. I stay awake at night trying to think so I can explain it to other people. Sometimes I thought it was a dream. Sometimes I thought I was watching someone else. Sometimes I thought it was real. End quote. Sullivan followed up, asking Mack if Betty had asked him to kill her that night as they drove out to the hunting lease, to which he replied that she hadn't. She was just talking about death and heaven and her problems. Sullivan then asked a simple but powerful question. How did he feel about Betty in those moments leading up to blasting half of her skull out? Mack's answer likely caused his attorney to wince, but nonetheless it went on the record. Mack told Sullivan, quote, I felt toward her like she was a hurt little kitten who had been left out in the rain and had to be brought in. End quote. Apparently, in Mack Herring's world, the way you help little kittens is by shooting them in the head. Sullivan then changed strategies and began asking Mack about his life since the murder. He asked if he'd had a normal life since that day, to which Mack replied he had not. So, Sullivan began down the trail. Did he go to the movies? Yes. Did he go to football games? Of course. The carnival? Yeah, he'd gone. Had he been on any dates? Yeah, he had. But Mack went on to state that while he had done all of those things, he didn't have as much fun as he used to. Did he remember kissing Betty goodbye? Yes, he did. Sullivan quickly pivoted, asking, "Why did you sink her body into that pond?" Mack replied, quote, "She said she wanted to disappear and never be found." End quote. So now it was on to the real meat of the matter. The defense was arguing that Betty had browbeaten Mack so long, so endlessly, with such intensity that she had worn down his mental faculties to the point where he did what she wanted, unable to determine on his own right versus wrong. Sullivan began to question Mack about the day Betty asked, Monday the 20th, the day he agreed, Tuesday the 21st. How much time had they spent together in those 2 days? They'd broken that down into a tight little schedule. The two had shared 3 5-minute car rides. There was also a 3-minute conversation in the hallway at school. Finally, there was the 10-minute conversation in the prop room on Tuesday afternoon when Mack finally agreed. When you add it all together, between Monday and Wednesday, when Mack came to pick her up and kill her, the two had spoken for just 28 minutes. That's all it took. In just 28 minutes, broken up into 3 5-minute talks, one 3-minute talk, and a 10-minute talk, Betty had begged and pleaded and argued so passionately that Mack had been rendered incapable of making a rational choice. 28 minutes. Grab a drink, take a seat, and watch an episode of your favorite sitcom. It'll take you longer to watch it than it took Mack to go from Betty is joking to no, I won't kill you to fine, I'll do it. Mack's only response to this? Quote, I can't tell when I lost reality after she kept asking me to kill her. End quote. Next up was Ike Nail, the guy who had taken Betty home that night and from whose car she leapt into Mack's Jeep. Here, things changed somewhat slightly. As Nail explained what happened that night, the words spoken weren't what they had been before. Whether it had been misreported or taken down improperly, now on the court record, Nail testified that Betty had said, quote, my God, I didn't think he would come. I'm going down there and call his bluff. End quote. Maybe it's a minor discrepancy, but there's a huge difference between I'm going down there and call his bluff and I've got to call his bluff even if it kills me. Nail went on to state that Betty had tried to commit suicide several times, even though there's no evidence for that, and that all of his classmates, quote, knew that she wanted to get killed. As interesting as that may be, the vast majority of their classmates thought she was joking or seeking attention, not that she wanted to die. When Nail was asked if he thought Betty meant it or not, he replied, quote, she was 100% serious, end quote. Reporter Phil Record of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram was called by the prosecution. On the stand, Record stated that he interviewed Mack on March 23rd while he was being held in jail. According to Record, Mack had told him that he, quote, didn't sleep the night of the murder because I was afraid I would get caught, end quote. When Record asked him what he thought would happen to him, Mack apparently replied that he'd probably go to the electric chair. This, the prosecution felt, showed that Mack had been fully aware of the consequences of his actions but had gone through with them anyway. Another reporter, John Sliney of the Odessa American, was called. Sliney stated that he had interviewed Mack just 10 hours after the murder. He described Mack as, quote, calm, cool, and collected and showing no emotion whatsoever, end quote. Mack had previously told reporters he didn't know why he had done it, suggesting he must be crazy. Sullivan asked Sliney, in all of his years as a reporter, had a crazy person ever admitted that they were crazy? No, Sliney replied. No, they haven't. Sheriff Edens was next to answer questions. Edens testified that when he spoke to Mack after he'd pulled Betty's body from the pond, Mack acknowledged that he didn't think he'd ever get caught. Sheriff Edens explained, quote, he said he thought the body would never be found because it had been weighted down. He knew the tank wouldn't dry up in the summer, and further thought in a year or so, enough mud and other debris would hide the body. End quote. For his part, Burnett asked few questions of the law enforcement officials outside of whether or not they had degrees in psychiatry or were equipped to give expert opinions on Mack's state of mind. They would, of course, answer in the negative. Closing arguments were issued next. Warren Burnett told the jury that Mack was insane at the time this happened. It was the only legitimate explanation. Dr. Grice concurred with that theory, as did pretty much everyone who knew Mack. Then Burnett turned on the offense, pointing towards the prosecution's table and reminding the jury they had promised they would supply a motive for the crime, but they never did. Therefore, there was only one answer: that Mack Herring had been temporarily insane. Dan Sullivan came out for his closing argument, though he was neither as smooth a talker as Burnett, nor did it seem was he entirely prepared for the way the Sanity hearing had progressed. Sullivan told the jurors that Mack had been sane at the time of the shooting. None of the evidence suggested any kind of a break with reality, and if indeed Mack had been so worn down by Betty's pleas over just 28 minutes between two different days, why was he insane only when he pulled the trigger, hours after he'd agreed to commit the murder in the first place? It was clear Mack Herring was lying. He didn't do this to help Betty Williams. He did this to kill her. Sullivan hammered the point home, telling the jury, quote, he knew if he pulled the trigger, Betty Williams would be dead, and he did it with the cunning of a murderer. End quote. On Saturday, February 24th at 5:07 p.m., the Sanity hearing was completed, and now the decision rested in the hands of the jury. Before midnight that first night, the jurors took a small poll. The vote was sitting at 10-2 in favor of ruling that Mack had been legally insane at the time of the murder. On Monday morning, they sent in a request to have Dr. Grice's testimony read back to them. Then, after only 11 hours of deliberation, they returned their verdict. Mack Herring had been legally insane at the time of the crime, but was no longer insane today. As a result of their ruling, Mack walked out of the courtroom a free man who could never be tried for the murder of Betty Williams. Dan Sullivan, however, wasn't about to let things go that easily. He made a motion for a mistrial, stating that the judge had erred when giving his instructions to the jury. The 1957 law, which Burnett had utilized to get this hearing, specifically said they must analyze the defendant's mental capacity both at the time of the crime and in the courtroom. Olson overruled Sullivan, and thus the trial of the century was complete. But this case was far from over. In early March of 1962, District Attorney Dan Sullivan announced his plan to appeal to the state Supreme Court to have the ruling of the Sanity hearing overturned and to finally hold a real murder trial against Mack Herring. On Friday, March 9th, Sullivan requested that the Supreme Court issue a new hearing. A writ of mandamus asked the court to command District Judge G.C. Olson of Kermit to, quote, vacate and set aside a judgment declaring John Mack Herring insane at the time of the offense alleged in the indictment pending against him in such court. End quote. Sullivan's request was based on his assertion that the hearing was, quote, void as a matter of law in that there exists no statute, criminal or civil, or under common law, which grants to a district court the power or authority to order such a preliminary trial to determine the sole question of a defendant's insanity at the time of the alleged offense. End quote. The Supreme Court ultimately agreed to hear arguments from both the defense and prosecution on April 25th. When it came time to speak before the Supreme Court, Warren Burnett argued vehemently that Mack had received a full hearing and all of the evidence related to the case had been heard. Sullivan countered that the only expert testimony given came from a psychiatrist Burnett had selected, and that the state had been denied its right to have the defendant examined by a psychiatrist of their own. In a plea to the court, Sullivan stated that this decision could turn Texas legal systems on its head, arguing that the case now is where a person can say, I was insane for 5 minutes at the time of the offense, but I'm okay now. After hearing arguments, the Supreme Court stated that they would consider the matter and would have a ruling in the near future. 2 weeks later, though, Fate would play another hand as Judge Olson passed away on May 9th at the age of 65. He had served on the bench for 16 years and had been set to retire in December. As a result of this, the Supreme Court stated that they would hold off on their ruling pending a determination to be issued by the judge set to replace Olson. They noted that if the replacement did not overturn the Sanity hearing ruling, then they would allow the state to alter their argument, essentially replacing Judge Olson's name with the new judge's. On the afternoon of Thursday, June 7th, Judge Russell D. Austin took the oath of office, officially replacing Judge Olson in the district court. One day later, on Friday the 8th, Dan Sullivan and John Banks filed a motion asking for a new Sanity hearing. At that time, Judge Austin stated he would need time to examine the court transcript and to familiarize himself with the issue at hand. On June 14th, just 1 week after taking office, Judge Austin refused to toss out the previous trial, forcing Banks and Sullivan to return to the Supreme Court with their amended request. Nearly 2 weeks later, on June 27th, the Supreme Court unanimously tossed out the Sanity hearing verdict, ruling that Judge Olson had improperly assumed jurisdiction when he allowed the Sanity hearing. The court ultimately agreed with the state's contention that the court could not rule on Mack's sanity at the time of the crime without also determining his sanity at the time of the trial. When one reporter approached Burnett and asked his thoughts on the ruling, the legal genius was caught off guard. He hadn't heard this ruling and turned to the reporter and said only, "You're not serious." 4 months later, in October, Judge Austin ruled that the murder trial would necessitate a change of venue, moving it out of Winkler County and away from Odessa. Judge Austin stated he didn't believe Mack Herring could get a fair trial in an area where the media had so thoroughly covered the case. On Saturday, October 13th, the case was officially transferred to the city of Beaumont, 618 miles east of Odessa, shifting the trial from West Texas to just next to the Louisiana border. Judge Owen M. Lord would preside and announced that he hoped to begin the trial as early as November or December. Burnett opposed moving the trial so far away, arguing that it would inconvenience witnesses, but his objection was overruled. The trial would finally see the inside of a courtroom in December. It began as most expected it to, with Burnett attempting to have the case dismissed. He argued that his client had already legally been acquitted, but Judge Lord overruled him, noting that the Supreme Court had voided that acquittal. Next, Burnett tried to argue that moving the case from Kermit to Beaumont was not in accordance with the law, but Judge Lord dismissed that argument too. The prosecution then made a motion asking the judge to prohibit Burnett from mentioning the previous Sanity hearing, which Judge Lord granted. So, the state finally has what it wants. Mack Herring will stand trial for the murder of Betty Williams, and Burnett would likely argue a defense of temporary insanity. While everyone believed the prosecution was going to come out swinging, they barely expressed a whimper. They called in witnesses, with their star being Betty's mother, Mary. Mary testified that her daughter did not want to die and was discussing and making plans for the future as recently as the night she was killed. They called a psychiatrist, who gave his opinion that Mack had been sane when he'd pulled the trigger. By Monday, December 10th, the state rested its case. They had called Dr. Ray Story, the pathologist who had performed the autopsy on Betty, B.R. McAlpine, who had originally questioned Mack, and Winkler County Sheriff Bill Edens. Immediately following the last witness's testimony, Burnett made a motion for an acquittal and was again denied. McAlpine testified that Mack had at first lied about what had happened, but later admitted the murder and claimed that he had killed Betty because she had continually asked him to do so. Dr. Story testified that the autopsy had shown that Betty was neither pregnant nor had she been sexually assaulted the night she died. Burnett called many of the same witnesses he'd called in the original Sanity hearing, and they delivered testimony in line with what they had previously. In addition, Mr. Burnett called Murray Spadell, the assistant principal at Odessa High, who stated that Mack Herring had never caused any trouble and was a good student. Next was Dr. Percy Bailey, a Beaumont area psychiatrist who testified that Mack seemed like a perfectly healthy and normal boy prior to the murder and expressed his opinion that he was sane after the shooting. Burnett also called Mack's parents to the stand initiating the first time anyone had actually seen Mack express emotion. He wept as his parents testified. For a murder trial which had begun on Monday the 3rd, closing arguments were already being made on Wednesday the 12th. Burnett, seeming to have learned something from the previous hearing, had elected not to have Mack testify in his own defense. That left just one question before the jury, and it was simple. Was Mack Herring insane when he pulled that trigger? The only testimony in the entire trial that had caused confusion was that of the psychiatrists, arguing for and against the insanity defense. In hopes of nudging them in the right direction, all three prosecutors issued their own closing arguments. Dan Sullivan may have provided the strongest effort, telling the jury, quote, "There is a forgotten person in this case. The forgotten person is dead and buried and in her grave. There is no one left to speak for her but you and me. It may have been a game of chicken with her, but it wasn't a game of chicken with him. He's no chicken." End quote. Sullivan explained to the jurors that someday, after facing punishment for his actions, Mack might be able to return home to be with his family, but the Williams would never have their daughter back. They'd never celebrate another birthday or holiday with her. As he talked to the jury, Sullivan walked around the courtroom, brandishing the 12-gauge shotgun that Mack had used to end young Betty's life. Jack DeWitt, chief felony prosecutor for the Jefferson County DA's office, was a member of the prosecution team. DeWitt was a sharp man who was known for his ability to connect with a jury. Talking about the possibility that Mack was insane, but only for the time that it took him to pull the trigger, DeWitt described that scenario as straining the boundaries of imagination. Finally, DeWitt turned towards the jury and stated, quote, "Can anyone in this courtroom say, in good conscience, that this girl wanted to die? She wanted to go to Odessa College, like him," end quote. DeWitt was pointing at Mack Herring. He continued, quote, "Not even Mr. Burnett can tell you, a psychiatrist, or God what happened out there," end quote. DeWitt went on to explain that there were only two witnesses that night, Betty Williams and Mack Herring, and Betty Williams had been killed by Mack Herring. For his part, Warren Burnett appealed to the jury's sense of justice, but also their tender hearts. He addressed the elephant in the room, this overwhelmingly difficult to believe story about a boy so worn down by the desperate pleas of his former lover that he shot her down, not in cold blood, but as a mercy. Burnett turned gentle as he spoke to the jury, saying, quote, "I can't explain this tragedy. Something went wrong in the mind of this boy and girl. Does the evidence show you any possible explanation? Until some evidence is brought to show the psychiatrists were wrong, I'd be inclined to believe them. These people have suffered for 2 years. The suffering may have been greater or lesser for Mr. and Miss Williams. I don't know. This jury has a chance to save a life. It doesn't make it right to compound one tragedy with another." End quote. The trial officially concluded just before 2 p.m. that Wednesday, and then it was left in the hands of the jury, 11 men, 1 woman. To determine where they stood, the jury held a vote just before midnight. As it stood, 9 members of the jury were ready to vote not guilty, while only 3 jurors remained undecided. On Thursday, December 13th, the jury reached a verdict. At 9:50 a.m. in front of a packed courthouse, the jury announced their decision that John Mack Herring was not guilty due to temporary insanity. In essence, they had ruled that Mack was insane for the 1 second it took him to pull that trigger, not before or after. The courtroom erupted in a show of solidarity for Mack, who hugged his lawyer and then his parents. Joe and Mary sat in stunned silence before quietly sneaking out of the courtroom in hopes of avoiding the reporters. It didn't work. Ultimately, Mary would tell the media that she believed the law needed to be changed, while Joe argued that he didn't want to see Mack go to the electric chair. He had hoped to see the teen receive a life sentence. Joe called the verdict a gross miscarriage of justice. Joe and Mary Williams returned home to Odessa. to prepare to celebrate Christmas with their 3 children, knowing all the while that Betty's empty room would be there, haunting them. For Mack, it was a time of celebration. After leaving the courtroom, he returned to his hotel, just a few miles away, where he was joined by friends and admirers who promptly tossed him into the pool. According to the Odessa American, Mack planned to return to classes at Odessa College, where he was majoring in English. Time moved on in Odessa, and after a few years, there were few who still spoke about Betty Williams and the night she kissed Mack Herring moments before he killed her. Those who hadn't cared for Betty in life were unmoved for her in death, and much like it had seemed to be the plan since the beginning, they started sweeping it under the rug. The facts of what occurred that March night in 1961 started to blur with rumor and speculation. Names and locations changed. The cycle of events got twisted. For the most part, everyone involved just wanted to let it go. Even Betty's parents, who must have suffered greatly with the loss of their eldest child, didn't say much. They too moved on with their lives, knowing there was little else they could do. The jury had rendered their decision, and there was no getting it thrown out this time. The fact of the matter was, Betty was gone, and Mack Herring was free to live the rest of his life without consequences for stealing hers. In Odessa, few viewed the outcome as unfavorable. They had always stood with Mack, and they continued to stand with him in the aftermath. Betty's name vanished from the headlines. There was no dedication to her in the yearbook, no in memoriam page, nothing. For many, it was as if she never existed. But for those who loved her, those who spent time with her, those who always imagined her being there was nothing that could fill the hole left behind by Betty Williams. Soon, we will be older and grown up, really grown up, and will be made to realize and believe in different things. Perhaps before we are completely grown, we'll be made to believe in war, hate, and death, just as our parents before us have learned. Betty Williams, 1961. So, life moves on. The world keeps on spinning and times change. Old buildings are torn down, new ones take their place. City streets transform from dirt to asphalt. Highways grow wider and longer. Memory remains, but even time has its way of eroding the details. Looking back becomes like trying to discern faces in a blurry photograph. You might recall the place you were, the song that was playing, but a lot gets lost somewhere between. A lot of people made a conscious choice to forget Betty, but those who feel the greatest pain at her absence can never forget the vibrant, intelligent, talented young actress who was light years ahead of her time. Betty Williams wasn't a freak. She wasn't a nothing. She was a living, breathing human being with emotions and feelings who met her end under the most mysterious of circumstances in what many, to this day, believe was nothing other than a cold-blooded murder. The reality of Betty's death might most easily be understood with a simple statement. For folks in 1960s Odessa, it may have been vastly easier to understand that Mack Herring was a good, upstanding citizen who lost touch with reality that night, because at least that they could hang their hat on. When it came to Betty Williams, they didn't know where to begin when it came to understanding who she was, what she wanted, and why she did the things she did. What's going to be harder to explain? Killing because you were asked to, or how a 17-year-old girl could be so independent, rebellious, driven, passionate, and theatrical? Remember, these were folks who still believed that Elvis Presley's hips were something to fear. 43 long years after Betty's death in 2004, her cousin Shelley finished a project he'd been working on for the better part of 20 years. He published his book, Washed in the Blood, an examination not only of the murder of his beloved cousin, but of Odessa itself. Things had surely changed after so many years, but deep in the heart of those who had been there when Betty walked the streets, no amount of time could erase a light that bright. Shelley has expressed that his desire to write the book had less to do with the crime and more to do with his belief that Betty, the real Betty, had been lost somewhere between all the rumors and speculation. He explained to the Odessa American, saying, quote, "My cousin was depicted as a crazy young woman who deserved to die. I was outraged at that. I knew her as the funniest, brightest, most outgoing of people. It wasn't right. I took it as my personal responsibility to set the record straight. I had to do it." End quote. Around this time, Dan Sullivan sat down for an interview. He knew Betty's case would be brought up, especially with the publicity around Shelley's book. Sullivan suggested that, back in 1962, juries were a little less jaded and they didn't fully understand the psychological aspects of the case. He explained, quote, "It was quite an exciting trial. There was a lot of public interest. The defendant was 19 years old and never had been in trouble. Warren filled the courthouse full of character witness who said he was a good fellow. People would trust their daughters with him, that sort of thing. I just don't think the jury was ready to convict him. Jurors are a lot more difficult to convince today that someone should escape the consequences of his actions than they were 40 years ago." End quote. Sometimes, the harder you try to hide something, the further you try to bury it, the faster it rises to the surface. What draws people in faster than a taboo concept, an unacceptable thought, a mystery without an answer? In a sense, the attempts to conceal Betty's story, her life, and her death resulted in a bubbling from beneath the surface. Slowly, over time, rumors began to permeate the walls of Odessa High. There were stories about a former student, a female student, who had died during her senior year, and it was suggested that she still walked the halls of the school. The auditorium of Odessa High once had a series of large windows. Over the years, as stories of the ghost of the school continued to evolve and transform, there came a routine. Students would drive up to the school close to midnight. Precisely at the stroke of midnight, they'd flash their headlights and honk their horns. Word was, if you'd done it just right, the ghost would appear in one of the windows. Eventually, the administration grew tired of that behavior and had the windows painted over. Many years later, when the school underwent structural changes, they had the windows bricked over entirely. Yet another attempt to erase Betty from the world, but just like in life, she wasn't going to give in so easily. To this day, there are stories of the ghost of Odessa High. Some even claim to have seen her or felt her, from the student body to the faculty. Carl Moore, a theater arts teacher, told Texas Monthly that not a single day goes by that he doesn't hear the name Betty in his classroom. He explained, quote, "Whenever something unexplained happens, a book falls on the floor in my classroom or the light board goes out during a technical rehearsal, someone always jokes, 'It's Betty.'" End quote. She has, in her own sense, been elevated to the status of a legend, but also someone that the outsiders claim as their own. As Shelley explained, quote, "The role that she plays today is as the patron saint of all the weirdos, the kids who aren't the most popular, the ones who aren't in the kind of ruling clique, the ones taking a different path. It's positive to find out that her memory still motivates kids at Odessa High School." End quote. The award-winning Texas Monthly piece entitled "A Kiss Before Dying" was released in February of 2006, just shy of 45 years since Betty Williams died. For the first time in decades, several people who had known Betty or attended Odessa High agreed to speak about what happened, what they believed, and how the pieces fit together. Dixon Bowles, a friend of Betty's, gave his view on the horrible murder, saying, quote, "I think Betty trapped herself in a real-life drama of her own making. She was ad-libbing all the way and it spun out of control. I remember a teacher taking me aside afterward and asking me, 'Was Betty pregnant?' And I said, 'No, I wish it were that simple. It was a game of chicken, and she never backed out.'" End quote. Sandra Schofield, another former Odessa High alumnus, always felt that Betty had been unfairly maligned both before but especially after her death. She explained, quote, "Nobody talked about how Mack could have said no. Betty had enlisted him, this worthy young man, to do what she didn't have the courage to do herself. She had roped him into doing it. So she became not the victim, but the villain. End quote. For the most part, the hindsight of 40 to 60 years can really change the way a certain memory plays out. Maybe you've thought about it every day for decades and decades, and then one day, you see it in a new light, or you remember a lost detail. There are some who look back with regret at the decision they made at the time, but that is somewhat the curse of maturity. Everyone gets to remember how foolish they were in high school, except for Betty Williams, because she never got a chance to move on and grow up. So, what about the two most important people in Betty's life? Her cousin Shelley and her dear friend Gail. Where do they stand and what do they believe? Even after all this time, all of the years he spent pursuing the truth, Shelley just can't be certain exactly what happened that night. Does he believe that Betty wanted to die? Certainly not. But then, what game was she playing? Asked his thoughts about Mac after the passage of so much time, Shelley replied, quote, I can't tell you whether he was really disoriented and didn't know right from wrong, but his response and behavior would suggest that he didn't really understand something, whether it was the value of life or the nature of living. I don't know what it was. There was something wrong with him, and that suggests to me at the very least he should have gotten intensive therapy. I think he must have had some very serious demons. Why does someone say yes to playing God? End quote. Gail shared a similar opinion and believed that the way Betty was dehumanized after her death was perhaps more brutal than the way in which she had been killed. She told Texas Monthly, quote, I think Betty used this to get Mac's attention and sympathy. For both of them, this was almost a joke. They didn't laugh about it, but it was almost a dare. What happened was Betty's memory wound up being quickly and easily completely trashed. It was like they erased her as a human being and put some trashy cartoon in her place. By doing that, it was easier to say, well, look at who she was and how she behaved. It was no big loss. End quote. Mack Herring went on to live a rather unremarkable life in Odessa. He went on to attend Texas Tech University, where allegedly he was once introduced to his class as the famous Mack Herring. He graduated and worked for his father. Later, he took on different careers, working as a dock foreman at a chemical plant and sprinkling in the odd carpentry job here and there. He would eventually become an electrician, helming Herring Electric. He married twice and divorced twice. He moved into a quiet little home not so far from the one he'd grown up in, except now he was on Betty's side of town. He never spoke publicly about the case again after his trial and seemingly did his best to avoid being in any situation where it might come up. He never ran into trouble with the law. He never did much of anything to show legitimate remorse or regret about the life he took. On Saturday, January 5th, 2019, he passed away quietly at the age of 75. Newspapers all around Texas ran headlines announcing that the gunman made infamous by the kiss and kill murder had died. It seemed that after 58 long years, he never managed to get out from under the cloud of Betty Williams. As calm, collected, and emotionless as he was back in 1961, maybe he never thought about her again after that trial. But I like to imagine that at least once a day, the bright blue eyes of Betty Williams flashed through his mind. Perhaps he thought that once he pulled that trigger, he'd never have to deal with Betty again. But as anyone who's ever killed can account, you never truly forget. Elizabeth Jean Betty Williams was killed at approximately 1:15 a.m. on the morning of Wednesday, March 22nd, 1962, at the age of 17. She never graduated from Odessa High, never got to break free of the town she despised that seemed to return the favor. She never had the opportunity to act on a big stage or stand in the spotlight of Hollywood. Yet, more than 60 years later, her name and her story remain one of the most haunting and disturbing mysteries in the history of West Texas. If she were alive today, Betty would be celebrating her 79th birthday today, Thursday, August 11th. What might she have done with her life? Famous actress, counterculture icon, theater teacher. Sadly, We'll never know what she may have had to offer this world, given the time and opportunity to reach her peak. There are no words I can find within myself to properly eulogize or honor the memory of Betty Williams, so perhaps it's best to leave you with one last piece of writing from Betty herself. Life is full of pitfalls which must be avoided if man is to arrive at the end of his journey unblemished by life's ugliness. But falling into disrepute, one need not give in wholly to despair. For just as surely as there is a path into darkness, there is too a path out of it. Hope is the light which illuminates man's way out of the blackness. Everywhere I go, people always ask me, what true crime podcasts do I listen to? What shows do I think are the best? I know there's a lot of great pods out there, but there's a handful that I absolutely love. One of my favorites is Gone Cold, Texas, and considering this week's episode takes place in Odessa, there's no better time to bring them up. They cover a lot of lesser known cases, Texas cases that still need to be solved. If trace evidence works for you, I think you'd really love Gone Cold, Texas, so let's let them tell you about the show.
Texas is best known for the scorching heat, longhorn steers, and incomparable barbecue. Beyond Big Bend and big trucks, however, lies something dark: big crime. Hi y'all, my name is Vincent. Join me on Gone Cold Podcast, Texas True Crime, as we dive deep into the facts and theories of one of the 20,000 unsolved Texas cases each week. From the mysterious 1974 disappearances of Rachel Trelisa, Renee Wilson, and Julie Mosley, collectively known as the Fort Worth Missing Trio, to the Orange, Texas abduction and murder of 4-year-old Denaria Finley in 2002. To hear those and nearly 200 other stories of unsolved homicides and missing persons cases, subscribe to Gone Cold, Texas True Crime, wherever you fulfill your podcast needs.
I first learned the story of Betty Williams' case a few years ago when I sat down to check out a show called A Crime to Remember. Each episode focused on a different case from the 1970s and earlier, cases that most people have never heard of. I can honestly say that when I saw the episode on Betty, I was completely blown away. How could something like this happen? From the story Mack Herring told police to the way the town and the school responded by demonizing Betty and praising Herring was, to say the least, heartbreaking and maddening. Fascinated, I turned to Shelley's book, Washed in the Blood. Here, Betty's cousin gave us not only a breakdown of their family dynamic, but his personal perspective as someone who grew up in Odessa and was 16 years old when all of this happened. For his part, Shelley grew up in a different part of town and attended a different high school. In his recollection, he noted how there was no one at his school who thought anything positive about Mack Herring. He killed Betty Williams in cold blood, and not a soul bought his story about her begging him to. Just a few miles away, though, back at Odessa High, Mack was the hero, while Betty was labeled an evil woman who had seduced him into murder. Of course, 61 years later, we still don't really know what happened that night. At least, we don't know the whole story. We have Mack Herring's side of the story, but we're never going to know what was really going on in Betty's mind that night. Did she want to die? Hell, did she even know Mack had a shotgun in the car? The sad truth is, we're likely never going to know the answer to those questions. Betty was killed in 1961. Mack died in 2019, and for the vast majority of his life, he never discussed the case, at least not with anyone who reported back what he had to say. In his book, Shelley noted that at one point in time, some students at Odessa High became interested in Betty's story. This would have been sometime in the 1980s. In the newspaper one afternoon, they saw a sale listing for a boat owned by Mack Herring. Seeing this as their opportunity to meet the killer himself, they went over and knocked on the door, feigning interest in the boat. Suddenly, one of the teens turned to the older man and asked him, "Are you the guy that killed Betty Williams?" They all swore that Herring replied simply, "Guilty as charged." Same old Mac, cool as a cucumber, emotionless, seemingly still unaware that killing someone is wrong. So, for the past few hours, I've just told you everything I could about the case, about Betty, about the town of Odessa, and the way things were in that place at that time. Betty's been described as many things over the years. To those who loved her, she was a brilliant young woman with a good heart and an amazing talent for acting and writing. Many have noted that in their minds, Betty had been a woman out of time. Had she been born 10 years later, her entire life might have been different since the world was different. She was interested in comedy, politics, social issues, and equality. Had she survived into her adult life, she may have become heavily involved in the changes that swept across the United States through the 60s and 70s. She was made for it, tough, willful, independent, and unafraid. Who knows what barriers she may have helped tear down? Then there's everyone else. The people who saw Betty as nothing more than a cheap teen who used sex to tempt and manipulate the locals. She was sinful, she broke all the rules and standards, and for some, that was enough to say she had gotten what she deserved. She upset the natural order of things, and that will ultimately turn against you. Now, I can't begin to wrap my head around looking at someone that way, like their life carried so little value that they didn't even think the killer should be punished. Hell, a lot of people felt like he should have never seen the inside of a courtroom. Instead, they flocked to him. Teachers and coaches praised him as this amazing guy who was helpful and kind and, above all else, normal. Girls from school flooded the courtroom, standing together and cheering for Mac, eventually earning themselves the title of Mac's Girls. Keep in mind, this is all happening in the courtroom while Betty's parents are sitting there hoping some kind of justice will get delivered. Throughout all of it, Betty was the one who was lost. While investigators looked for evidence and lawyers sought to understand the story, Betty was disregarded. Almost overnight, she became a disgrace. People spread rumors about the people she'd allegedly slept with. In their eyes, someone who behaved in that way didn't deserve to live, and perhaps on some almost subconscious level, they believed that while her death may have been horrific, it was probably what was best for the community, who needed a girl like Betty Williams hanging around. But here's the thing, and I think it's something that easily gets lost. The vast majority of people talking to police, discussing Betty and Mac, testifying in the courtroom, were high school students, 16 and 17 years old, just like Betty. So I have to ask, how many rumors that got spread around your high school were actually true? Maybe pieces of them, 5 or 10%, but for the most part, things get exaggerated and blown out of proportion. Maybe somebody gets caught cheating on a test. By the time the message cycles through enough people's mouths, it may be completely changed. Not only did he get caught cheating, he punched the teacher when she failed him. You know how it goes. So, how much of what people said about Betty's behaviors can we confirm is true? Well, the more you dig, the less you find. Yes, Betty was sexually active. We know that much straight from her cousin, Shelley, who she used to call just to discuss what guys she'd been with. We've heard of her diary where she apparently detailed her sexual encounters, but we can't know for sure what was in there. It doesn't exist anymore. While the town would lead you to believe there were countless entries, there may have only been a handful. I mean, let's face it, Betty wasn't doing anything different from what all the other popular girls were doing. She just didn't think all the pomp and circumstance of going steady was required. If she were sexually attracted to someone, well, she'd go for it regardless of what convention dictated. That was the difference between Betty Williams and the in crowd, at least one of the differences. They had sex and pretended they didn't. They kept it covered up, even though everyone knew. Betty had sex, and she wasn't ashamed of it. She didn't feel a need to hide or conceal it. Somehow, though, she had the audacity to be a woman in the 60s who enjoyed sex. How unforgivable. When you turn your focus back to what this is really all about, the night John Mack Herring shot Betty Williams at point blank range with a 12 gauge shotgun, there's a lot of details that just don't make sense when you put them together. So I think the best way to begin moving forward through some of the theories revolving around this case is to just start with the official story and see what cracks we find. Betty and Mac dated, and I use that term loosely, sometime between July and August of 1960. Their romance, if that's what you'd call it, wasn't long lasting or life changing. They dated for a month, and during that month, they broke up and got back together several times. Frequently, this relationship is presented like it was some big life changing event for Betty. She was head over heels in love with Mac. He was all she wanted. I don't know how much truth there is to that, honestly. The more I've researched and poured myself into the facts of this case, the less support I've found for this concept upon which the entire crime is based. The idea that, in the end, Betty was so heartbroken, so torn apart by losing Mac that she wanted to die at his hand. Or perhaps that she acted vastly more depressed than she was in hopes of obtaining Mac's attention. I don't know if I buy that, and I'll tell you why. First of all, it was a month. And I know when you're 17, every relationship can seem like the be all end all. Usually, though, they last a little longer than that. Factor in that Mac didn't kill Betty until March of 61, approximately 7 months after the breakup. On the one hand, they try to tell you that Betty was so hurt and lost that she clung to that relationship for all that time, and in the end, it was Mac she wanted back. Mac who meant the world to her. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm fairly certain if she was in love with someone, the last thing she would decide to do is go for a ride into the bushes with that guy's best friend. That's what Betty did, though, with Bill Rose, Mr. Popular, Mr. Handsome, Mr. Good Friend of Mack Herring. It's been presented that perhaps Betty did this to get revenge on Mac or to push him into going steady with her. He never gave her his jacket, introduced her to his friends, took her to meet his parents. Indeed, it appears that, at least to Mac, Betty was little more than a summer fling. At the same time, the narrative would dictate that Betty, as smart as she was, wasn't exactly aware of how he saw her. I can't help but wonder if some of the breakups they had over that month revolved around this exact subject. Well, Mac, if you really wanted to be with me, I wouldn't be a secret. That's entirely possible. But what if the story isn't what you thought it was at all? We've been told that Mac broke up with Betty, but what if it was the other way around? What if, in the end, it wasn't Mack Herring that Betty fell for, but his good friend Bill? In his book, Shelley printed several pieces of writing that came from Betty's hand. One of those pieces was a letter she'd addressed to Bill. There are certain points in that letter which call a lot of what we know about this story into question. So let's take a look at the letter and see if, in the end, we still agree with the narrative. The letter reads, quote, Bill, why? Why in the name of all of God's earth can't we arrive at some compromise? Though you never speak to me, seldom look at me, but often stub me, yet, all the same, you're pulling, tugging at my very soul until my whole being is strained and tense with the effort of controlling myself. I ask myself over and over, why? Why must it be this way? Yes, 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 I've realized now that what I did with you was wrong, but must you condemn me for it? You have condemned me, you know. Maybe not with your lips, but your every action cries hatred and damnation for all eternity. And yet, even with all that, you're more tolerant than Mac. He hates me for what I did to him, for what I made him do to himself, and yet he can't express his hatred in rage. He makes sly digs, causing me to writhe in embarrassment and fear. Daily, he punishes me, making remarks that no one understands but me, but I feel the entire world knows what he is doing to me and is applauding him and cheering him on. Do you hate me? Can you find it in your heart to hate someone as small and tormented as me? You have hurt me far more than I have hurt you. Your eyes, when they happen to meet mine, are filled with a strange expression or mixed expression that I cannot identify. I long to talk to you, but I know there is very little that we could say. Though you laugh and talk and joke with others, the thought of me causes you to hush instantly. Why? Why? What in God's name causes you to halt in your merriment? Is the memory of our time together so distasteful to you? Do you remember it with disgust? Can't you see what you're doing to me? I go through hell every day, a hell that we created together, you and me, and now only I am forced to live in it. Can you not find it in your heart to forgive me and be friendly? Yes, I am jealous. I get so jealous of you that I could scream and gnash my teeth and beat the trees in my rage. If I thought I could perhaps in some way bring you back to me, I would spare no effort to make you mine. I would be better off were you dead. Then I could perhaps forget you. But now I am daily constrained to see you and not speak to you, to love you and know that I am hated. I hate myself for loving you, and yet I hang on to my love for you as though it could pull me out of this pit of darkness I am forced to inhabit. My entire being cries, Bill, Bill, Bill. Even the birds mock me with their cries of Bill, Bill, Bill. And your friends, they know, don't they? Yes, Yes, I'm sure they do. They give me their hard knowing glances and I must pretend to not see. Pretense. You must pretend not to know me. I must pretend not to care for you. Mac must pretend that it was his idea to break up. Steve must pretend to ignore me. And dear sweet Dan and Jerry must pretend that they know nothing of the whole affair. God, my God, everything is one huge distorted lie. Bill, can't you see what you're doing to me? You're ruining me. You've torn me to bits. Half of me cries out to you, and the other half recoils in fear. I cannot even pray anymore. I know that God is so far away I cannot reach him. All I can do is cry piteously, God, my God, please. And yet, he never hears me. End quote. There's a lot to unpack there, but I think there's a couple of things that really stand out. Firstly, after hearing this letter, what seems more likely to you? That Betty was head over heels in love with Mack Herring or that she was in love with Bill? While we don't possess every letter or note Betty ever wrote, this letter to Bill mentions love multiple times, while Betty's letter to Mac after the breakup never does. Her letter to Mac reads like something a friend would write. Sorry I did this. I know you're mad. It's my fault, but we had some good times, right? She even wishes him best of luck with his new steady girlfriend. Yet in this letter, she talks of her jealousy, of her rage, of wanting to beat the trees and gnash her teeth because she can't have Bill, not Mac. Then there's the talk about everyone else. Bill must pretend he doesn't know Betty. She has to pretend she doesn't care for him. Steve has to ignore her. Dan and Jerry have to pretend they know nothing of the affair. Affair? That's a strange word to choose if this allegedly was just a one time thing. Perhaps Betty had been seeing Bill for a while, even while dating Mac. It's hard to say. The most important line, though, might be Mac must pretend that it was his idea to break up. What? If it wasn't Mac's idea to break up, then whose idea was it? Betty's? Bill's? Someone else's altogether? It's a very strange statement to make, and if true, really changes the complexion of the entire case. If Mac didn't break up with Betty, if it went down a different way, then how do we explain all this talk about how much she loved Mac and how she wanted him back and wanted to be near him? The only explanation I could come up with would be that maybe she loved Bill while she was with Mac, and when things went sideways and Bill turned cold and began ignoring her, maybe she turned back to Mac for comfort. Although, according to this letter, they didn't break up and become friends right away like Mac claimed. It sounds like he treated her pretty badly for a while afterwards. So we're never going to know what exactly was going on between Betty, Bill, and Mac, but I think it's safe to say there's far more evidence to suggest that Betty had a thing for Bill rather than her being madly in love with Mac. With that knowledge, how can you put your faith into the concept that Betty wanted to die because she couldn't have Mac? It just doesn't make any sense to me, and unfortunately, without being able to ask Betty herself, all we can really do is speculate about what exactly happened that summer and throughout the rest of the school year to that cold March night when Mack Herring shot and killed her. Next, we turn to Betty's state of mind. In the aftermath, a lot of people have come forward and claimed that she had been depressed, she was having trouble at home, she was having trouble with a boyfriend. There were all sorts of reasons given as to why she may have wanted to die or been suicidal. The thing about it is, if she was, those who were closest to her didn't actually think it was true. Shelley didn't think she wanted to die. She was vibrant and full of life. She was looking forward to getting out of Odessa High and moving on to the next chapter. She was dating an older man, a DJ. Doesn't really sound like she was all caught up on Mac. She asked her mother if she could get another job. She was making plans with Gail. These don't sound like the behaviors of someone who wants to die. But as we all know, when someone's mind enters that dark space, they're no longer thinking logically. There doesn't have to be a reason that would satisfy you or me, just enough for Betty to believe that she was better off dead. I didn't know Betty Williams, but I find it hard to believe anyone would want to die that way, dressed in those pajamas and being dumped in a little pond. I think it's worth noting that only after her death do people come forward and claim Betty asked them to kill her. No one went to a counselor, no one told a teacher, no one took it seriously because whenever she'd asked, they'd all end up joking about it. I also think it's worth noting that one after the other, pretty much every single person who says Betty asked was either friends with Mac or spent a lot of time around him. Now, in retrospect, Some have speculated that maybe Betty didn't want to die but was trying to get sympathy. By going to all these people and asking, maybe she knows they're going to tell Mac about it at some point, but that doesn't happen. So finally, she goes to Mac herself, but not in the way you'd imagine. Betty didn't pull Mac aside, put on a serious voice, and ask him in a way where he knew she wasn't kidding. She asked him during a car ride with another guy in there. Then they all laughed about it and took turns joking about different ways it could be done. Now, remember from the trial, according to the psychiatrist, Betty begged and pleaded so powerfully, so strongly that Mac became incapable of deciding between right and wrong, good and bad. Well, we know there were 3 5-minute car rides, one 3-minute talk, and one 10-minute talk, totaling the 28 minutes it took Betty to completely overwhelm Mac's mental faculties. Well, at least one of those car rides is the one we just discussed, so if we take that out, now we're down to 23 minutes. Ultimately, the jury determined that Mac was temporarily insane for only the 1 or 2 seconds it took him to pull that trigger. How does that really make sense, though? Here, let's run through some things and see how it all pans out. Tuesday, March 21st. Betty pulls Mac into the prop room in the drama department, and for 10 minutes she presses him. She says her life isn't going to get any better, that she's miserable, that she'd be better off dead. Finally, Mac agrees, tells her that he'll do it. They forge the plan. He'll come by at midnight and drive her to his father's hunting lease, where he'll kill her and conceal her body in the stock pond. According to the jury, Mac was perfectly sane when he agreed to this. He then steals some ropes, wire, and weights from the school, and he's still sane. He drives home, loads the shotgun, puts it in the car. Still sane. He goes to the play rehearsal, runs lines, hangs out with his friends. Then he leaves to drop off his girlfriend. Yeah, see, this is something that for some reason wasn't covered all that much in the media. Mac was dating someone when he killed Betty, and not just any random girl. He was dating Gail Guffey, Betty's best friend, the one who got the lead part in the play. Betty knew Gail. She was still close with Gail. This was her best friend. It doesn't sound like she was all that upset about Mac seeing someone else, let alone her dear friend. So Mac leaves rehearsal and drops Gail off, telling her he has to go fill his gas tank before heading home. He kisses her and leaves, and he's still sane. He drives to the gas station and fills up the Jeep, knowing it's a 30-minute drive out of Odessa to the stock pond, and he's still sane. He returns home, kills time, waits until midnight is approaching, and then begins driving to Betty's house. Still sane. He picks up Betty, drives her into Winkler County, and parks near the stock pond. Still sane. They exit the car and walk up to the shore. He's carrying a loaded shotgun. He is still sane. Betty runs back to the Jeep, grabs her duster because it's cold. She comes back and Mac requests a kiss to remember her by. He is still sane. Betty kneels down, lifts the shotgun barrel and holds it to her temple. He is still sane. Betty thanks Mac for what he's about to do and then calls out, "Now." Mac pulls the trigger. He's insane. Betty's body falls to the earth. Mac looks on at the grisly scene he has created. He's now sane again. Mac returns to the Jeep, puts the shotgun inside, and begins removing the ropes, weights, and wires. Sane. He ties the weights around Betty's waist, approximately 50 pounds of lead and tin tethered to her petite 98-pound frame. Still sane. He strips out of his clothes, grabs Betty by the ankles, and drags her into the water. Sane. He reaches the middle of the pond, the deepest part being approximately 5 feet. He glances up at 2 mesquite trees, using them as waypoints to remind him of exactly where her body is, and he is still sane. Mac walks out of the water, runs to the Jeep, and turns the heaters on full blast while he dries off and gets dressed. Sane. He puts his clothes on, somehow forgetting his boots at the scene, and begins driving back to Odessa. Sane. During the drive, he finds Betty's shoes in his Jeep, so he scoops them up and tosses them out the window along the highway. And he is still sane. Arriving home, Mac doesn't even eject the shell from the gun. He puts it back on the wall where he keeps it, and he is still sane. He takes a shower, changes for bed, goes to sleep. He is still sane. The next morning, he wakes up, has breakfast, and heads off to school like nothing happened at all because he is perfectly sane. When the detectives sit him down to ask him when the last time he saw Betty was, he lies and says play rehearsal. Then he admits he came to her house when she was with Ike Nail, but he swears he took her out for a Coke and then returned her home. That's his second lie, and he is still sane. Finally, after being brought down to the station, he breaks and confesses. He killed Betty because she asked him to. He is still sane. He leads the police to the stock pond. He tells the story. He removes Betty's body from the water. Sane. Standing no less than 10 feet from the nearly decapitated corpse of Betty Williams, Mack answers reporters' questions and discusses her murder with no more emotion than he might have describing a story he read or a movie he saw. Sane. In fact, in the professional opinions of at least one psychiatrist, he's unlikely to ever strike out violently again. To that doctor's credit, Mack never kills again, as far as we know. But how much sense does that make to you? How can Mack only be insane, or as Dr. Grice put it, dethroned of his reason during the pulling of that trigger? It wasn't insane to agree in the first place, or to grab the rope and the weights, or to load the gun, or to drive over to Betty's house, or to take her to the hunting lease, or to request a kiss before killing her. He's not insane when he disposes of the body, which he later confirms he believed would never be found. Bringing the gun, the ropes, the weights, having the spot picked out in advance, knowing what he's going to do with the body afterwards, lying to try and cover his ass that day. These are all indications of premeditation. You can't plan out a murder and simultaneously be too insane to think rationally. If it was insane to pull the trigger, wasn't it insane to go along with this at all? And in the end, I'm supposed to believe that Betty Williams was such a smooth talker, such a manipulative person, such a brilliant psychological combatant that she managed to talk this perfectly normal, kind, sweet 17-year-old guy into killing her in 23 to 28 minutes spread out over 2 days? I'll tell you, if that's how fragile Mack's psyche was, it's difficult to accept that he managed to live the rest of his life without ever again being temporarily insane, without ever killing anyone, and yet we know he didn't, or at least he was never connected to any other violent crimes. I tend to agree with the investigators, with Shelley, that Mack Herring killed Betty for one reason and one reason only, because that's what he wanted. We may never know what led up to this, what was going on in Mack's head, what happened in those 7 months between the time he dated Betty and the moment he killed her, but that is the answer the prosecution seemed to miss. Betty Williams died for one reason and one reason only, because Mack killed her. He could have told someone that she wanted to die, but he didn't. He could have gone for help to a teacher, a counselor, his parents, her parents, but he didn't. After just 28 minutes, he went from believing Betty was telling a morbid joke to agreeing that she would be better off dead and he should be the one to do it. So I have to ask, why the shotgun? Surely Mac could have come up with a way to kill Betty that wouldn't have been so brutal, that wouldn't have required her to have a closed casket at her funeral. Mac would claim that Betty came to his house and selected the shotgun he used. Funny how when he dated her, she never went to his house, but when it comes to selecting a murder weapon, he's okay with her stopping by. Mac is an experienced hunter. He knows his way around firearms. Several friends say he's got skill and he never comes back empty-handed when he goes out to hunt. Betty is nonviolent. She doesn't hunt. In fact, she finds the whole scenario to be disgusting, killing a defenseless animal for sport. Yet she's the one who picked out the gun. Strange how she happened to choose the very gun that Mac did all of his hunting with, isn't it? The one he'd be most familiar with, most comfortable with. The one he has the easiest access to because it's his and his parents aren't going to come looking for it. Does Mack Herring sound to you like someone who didn't know exactly what he was doing? Hell, it sounds to me like he planned this all out pretty well. And here's another question I've got. If Betty wanted to die, if she pressured Mac at school, if he'd finally agreed and they'd made the plan for him to show up at midnight, why did she go out with Ike Nail? Did she want Mac to catch them together to needlessly put a witness at the scene? If Ike Nail hadn't been there, would investigators have ever looked at Mack Herring as a legitimate suspect? Let's face it, if Ike wasn't there that night, when police come to school the next day and ask Mac the last time he'd seen Betty, he'd answer again that he last saw her at play rehearsal, except there wouldn't be anyone to contradict it. At that point, his plan would have went exactly as he wanted. Betty would be gone, no one was going to find her in that stock pond, and there would be no solid evidence linking him to the crime. Ike himself acknowledged that when Mac pulled up, Betty was somewhat surprised. She allegedly says, "Oh my God, I didn't think he'd come." Does that sound to you like someone who had locked in solid plans and expected them to actually play out? Then, depending on which story you believe, what originally gets told to reporters or what Ike testifies to, Betty either says, "I've got to call his bluff even if he kills me," or "I'm going down there and call his bluff." Which is the more reliable account? The one Nail gave to police the morning of the murder, or the one he testified to nearly a year later? Hell, in one interview, Ike refused to answer questions, noting that anything he said would only hurt Mack. Betty is dead, but once again, the concern and worry is for Mack's future, Mack's safety. Seriously, what is wrong with these people? For 61 years, people have been asking, did Betty Williams really want to die? Did she truly plan to ride off with Mack that night, kiss him goodbye, and get the back of her skull blasted out? It seems, if nothing else, Betty and Mack discussed him coming over that night, if her words to Ike were accurate. She didn't think he'd actually come through, though. This leads to a lot of people believing the theory that it was all a game of chicken, that this was some kind of a joke between Mack and Betty that went too far, and neither of them was willing to back out. Maybe Mack hoped Betty would tell him that she'd changed her mind. Maybe Betty believed Mack would throw down the gun and tell her he couldn't do it. Or maybe Mack always knew he was going to pull that trigger, whether Betty wanted it or not. Everything we know about the shooting comes straight from Mack. Had Betty said, "Wait, no, I don't want to die," moments before he shot her, would he have shared that with police? I doubt it. It appears Mack had one story and he stuck to it, with slight variations here and there. This made many people believe he was telling the truth, but for others, it was just as plausible that he'd come up with this story in advance and stuck to it. It seems like a lot for a teenager to devise this plan and be so calm and cool when talking to the police, but this is the same guy who killed Betty and didn't even flinch, not before and not after. I don't want to get too gruesome, but do you know what kind of a mess it makes when someone is shot at point blank range with a shotgun in the head? Mac would have had blood, hair, brain matter all over his clothes. The scene of the crime would have been hideous, the kind of stuff that makes hardened police officers and ambulance drivers nauseous. But Mac wasn't. He walked through that bloody mess, tied the weights, and walked her into the pond. To him, it seems the murder of Betty Williams were no more disturbing or emotional than if he'd shot a jackrabbit or a quail. Even when he's asked about it, he describes feeling towards Betty like she was a wet kitten laying in the gutter that needs to be brought in. Apparently, to Mac, the best thing you can do for someone in desperate need of assistance is kill them. He claims she was so sad, so overwhelmed. She was miserable and lost. She needed his help to get off this planet and into heaven. Strange, since in some of her writing she talks about being disconnected from God, about losing her faith. Yet here in the end, despite believing she had done bad things and was a bad person, she sure was certain she was going to heaven. Seems rather contrary to the way she was raised, by a father who frequently told her she was sinful and would go to hell. So Mac kills her because he felt sorry for her? How sorry could he have felt? After the murder, he throws her shoes out of the car like trash. He didn't hold a sacred space for her. He didn't love her and see this as the only way to help. She meant nothing to him, not in life and not in death. One reporter asked him if he loved Betty, and he replied that he did when they dated, but he didn't anymore. Must have been some truly strong love that 7 months later, your reaction to killing that person is essentially no reaction at all. Of course, we don't know what really happened that night. In all likelihood, we never will. Whether Betty knew she was going to die, whether she planned it, whether Mac was doing what she'd asked, or whether Betty thought they were just going up there to park or talk or something else, and then the gun came out, there's just no way of finding the truth. All I can really say is that the words of the man who killed Betty not only don't make any sense to me, but how much can you really rely on the murderer to tell you why? But what about the letter, right? Betty wrote a letter absolving Mac of what he had done. She took all of the blame on herself, confirmed that she asked him and hoped that he wouldn't be punished for it. Well, I've got a couple problems with this letter. Firstly, the way it comes about. Mac is being questioned about what happens. He leads police to the body. He tells his father he killed Betty. At no point is this note mentioned. Instead, he pulls his dad aside and asks him to go and find it, the note Betty wrote, because that'll clear this all up. Wouldn't you have told police about this note the first time they asked you why you did this? If the cops are banging on your door accusing you of murdering someone and you're trying to explain that that person asked you to, wouldn't that note be at the forefront of your mind? Yes, officer, she asked me to. I swear, look, here's a note she wrote me. But that doesn't happen. The police go to the Herring home to retrieve the shotgun, but they're not told about the note. It's not until later that O.H. Herring hands it over to them, like, oh, by the way, here's a note Betty wrote to prove that Mac was only doing what she asked. That note is eventually sent off to Austin, where handwriting experts authenticate it, saying it is indeed Betty Williams' handwriting. Handwriting analysis isn't exactly a science that I put a lot of faith into today, let alone 61 years ago. I'll take their word for it, I suppose, but I wouldn't be surprised if the science of today might contradict what they determined back then. Curiously, Shelley didn't talk a lot about that letter in his book, but he did make one interesting comment. Apparently, throughout the 1980s, while he was trying to put the book together, a forensic analyst gave him a different opinion on the letter. While he agreed that it was indeed Betty's handwriting, he concluded they were not her words. It was his opinion that the letter was written by Betty, but had been dictated to her by someone else. That would certainly make things a little different. What if Betty didn't write that letter because she wanted to absolve Mac of his sins, but perhaps because a shotgun was pointing at her? Curiously, Howard Sellers, who was in the car when Betty apparently asked Mac and brought up the idea of writing a letter, said Mac showed him the letter on Tuesday before the murder. For his part, Mack Herring couldn't remember discussing or showing that letter to anyone. So, was that letter in existence that Tuesday, or was it not made up until later that night? Again, we may never know, but I'd like to read it again. All throughout this episode, I've quoted the words of Betty Williams. Let's see if this letter sounds like her voice. March 20th, 1961. I want everyone to know that what I'm about to do in no way implicates anyone else. I say this to make sure that no blame falls on anyone other than myself. I have depressing problems, problems that concern, for the most part, myself. I'm waging a war within myself, a war to find the true me, and I fear I'm losing the battle. Rather than admit defeat, I'm going to beat a quick retreat into the no man's land of death. As I have only the will and not the fortitude necessary, a friend of mine, seeing how great is my torment, has graciously consented to look after the details. His name is Mack Herring, and I pray that he will not have to suffer for what he is doing for my sake. I take upon myself all the blame, for it lies on me alone. Sincerely, Betty Williams. I think it's worth noting that when you see the actual letter in Betty's handwriting, it flows a little different. For instance, where it says, I have depressing problems, in the original, it just said, I have problems. But then a caret was added and the word depressing was inserted. Seems like someone thought it was important to put the word depressing in there. It doesn't read like Betty. She was a skilled writer who had talent. Her work is poetic, it's emotional and visual. This reads like a legal document, like a contract. Also, I find it strange that if the entire point of the letter is to absolve Mac, why doesn't his name get mentioned until the second to last sentence? Wouldn't you think the letter would be a little more along the lines of, I asked Mack Herring to end my life because I can't do it myself. Please don't punish him or hold him responsible? I don't know. The letter reads to me in one of two ways. Either those are not the words of Betty Williams and someone else is telling her what to write, or the letter itself was written in jest. They all joked about Betty wanting to die. Would it be so hard to believe that she could have taken the joke a step further? Also, isn't it kind of bizarre that someone who wrote extensively would write such a short little note like this and not mention anyone else? Nothing to say to her siblings, her parents, her friends, not a special message to her beloved cousin. There's no apology, there's no sadness, there's no emotion. It reads in a way much as I would expect someone who doesn't fully understand human emotion to think. Someone perhaps like calm, cool, and collected Mack Herring. Unfortunately, like so much of this case, we're never going to know. So finally, we turn towards what all crimes ultimately come down to: motive. It's the one area where the prosecution just couldn't find their footing, the one place where investigators couldn't get what they needed. Defense attorney Warren Burnett was right when he told the jury that the prosecution had promised to deliver a motive and never did. In the absence of any evidence to show a different side of the story, all you really had to go on is what Mac admitted to, and I can see why people would believe someone would have to have been insane to have gone through with it. Although, I'd have argued that the entire plot was insane, not just pulling the trigger. Looking at the letter Betty wrote to Bill, it seems clear that she's tormented. She writes about Mac, how he's treating her badly, laughing at her, gossiping behind her back. He did it to her face, too. Told her she was cheap, that she was a ruined girl who didn't deserve attention from any man, at least not one who wanted to pursue something serious. He told her what others had told her, that she was a slut, and no man would ever want to be with someone like that. It seems kind of odd to me that Betty considered Mac so close, so reliable, so dependable that he's the one she asked to finally kill her. Not in a joking way, but honestly and directly. Maybe if Betty did want to die, Mac was chosen not because in spite of their past, but because of it. Maybe she knew Mac was angry enough with her that he'd actually do it. Or maybe in the end, she never believed it would happen. There is, of course, one other possibility that was discussed around that time. Police believed that if the autopsy had shown that Betty was pregnant, then maybe they could build a case around Mac killing her in order to avoid having to marry her. That's how things were back then. You got a girl pregnant, guess you're going to get married. Ultimately, the autopsy showed that Betty wasn't pregnant. So that theory went out the window, but did she really need to be pregnant for it to be a motive? What if she only told Max she were pregnant in some desperate attempt to win him over? Or what if someone had spread the rumor? Betty didn't have to know she was pregnant. Mac didn't have to confirm it. All it would have taken was one of them to believe it. Just based on the way investigators looked at it in 1961, there's a big part of me that feels like maybe in those 7 months between August and March, that Mac and Betty might have been seeing each other on the sly. Or maybe in the end, Betty Williams died because Mack Herring was a stone cold killer. I sincerely doubt we're ever going to find out what really happened there. Elizabeth Jean Betty Williams died 61 years ago. Dressed in pink baby doll pajamas and short shorts, she was killed with a 12-gauge shotgun and then had her body submerged into the dirty waters of a stock pond. John Mack Herring, the 17-year-old who had killed her, was found not guilty by reason of temporary insanity not once, but twice. He never had to face any direct consequences for what he had done, and in the end, people rallied around him and held him up like some kind of a martyr. Betty manipulated him, seduced him. She used sex and sympathy to twist his mind up to the point that he planned out and executed a rather meticulous murder. I mean, no offense to guys, because I am one, but it seems quite clear that the males were the power in Odessa. They could do no wrong. They were fragile and tender and so easy to trick and confuse. It seems like Betty Williams was just a scapegoat because it was a lot easier to blame the weird beatnik theater girl than it was to imagine a specimen of virtue and perfection such as Mack Herring could possibly have done anything wrong. It was all Betty. It always was. I don't know that we're ever going to see more information about this case released. Many files have been lost to time, many witnesses and key players have passed on. It appears that the kiss and kill murder of Betty Williams will remain one of West Texas's most disturbing, haunting, and brutal crimes for which there has never been a proper resolution. Over the years, there have been attempts to hide it all, to brush it under the rug, to brick over the truth the way Odessa High bricked over those auditorium windows. But if there is one thing I find comfort in, it's knowing that no matter how hard they tried, no matter how poorly they treated her, no matter who accused her of being the villain rather than the victim, they'll never erase her. Even 61 years later, her story speaks to us. Her legacy attracts us, and her life captures our attention just as much, if not more so, than the way in which she died. Betty Williams will never get a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. She may never have gotten to star in a Broadway play. But perhaps there is some comfort in knowing that, 6 decades later, people still talk about her, wonder about her, find a kinship with her, and mourn for her. Rest in peace, Betty Williams. If you're looking for more information about the shocking murder of Betty Williams, there are many news articles covering her case. The Odessa American and Texas Monthly had some of the most in depth coverage. The television show, A Crime to Remember, profiled Betty's case in the final episode of their third season. While it doesn't dig too deeply, it's a very interesting 1,000-foot overview of the case. Finally, I can't more highly recommend checking out Shelley's book, Washed in the Blood. It gives a great deal of insight into Betty, the Williams family, and Odessa itself. It's a heartbreaking tribute to loss, grief, and the unknowing. If you have any information about the murder of Betty Williams, please contact the Winkler County Sheriff's Office at 432-586-3461. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at traceevpod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Today's episode dealt with a lot of conversation revolving around suicide and suicidal ideation. If you or someone you love is struggling with thoughts of suicide, you are not alone, and help is available. Please call the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by dialing 988. They are available 24 hours a day and can provide assistance for those struggling with suicidal thoughts or emotional distress. You can also text them by sending the word TALK to 741-741 or by visiting the website for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention at afsp.com. For international listeners, help is available through the International Association for Suicide Prevention at their website, iasp.info. They can help you find resources available in your country, and they have a full directory of suicide prevention hotlines. I first started Trace Evidence a little over 5 years ago. It hasn't always been the easiest job to do, and I've faced a lot of challenges over the years. I could never have made it to episode 200 without help from some amazing people I'd like to thank right now. First, Robin Warder from The Trail Went Cold, Justin and Aaron from Generation Y, and Olivia from Something's Not Right. These folks, along with several others, helped inspire me to try my hand at podcasting, and I've never looked back. Next, I'd like to thank Esther Ludlow from Once Upon a Crime. Without her help a few years ago, I don't know that I'd have been able to continue making Trace Evidence. I'd also like to thank my ex-girlfriend for telling me just a little over 5 years ago that Trace Evidence would never be successful and couldn't possibly become my career. And then I'd like to thank my current girlfriend, Alicia, for supporting me through thick and thin and being with me through all the ups and downs of running this show out of my home office.